Let me see. Hey, Organizing 101, that's us. Looks like it's live.
Okay, cool. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, whether you're on the Zoom or on YouTube. This is our second Organizing 101 workshop. My name is Chris Blankenhorn. I'm joined by Garrett Wasserman. I am a former GPUS Green Party of the United States co-chair, serving from 2016 to 2018. I'm also the Illinois Green Party's secretary, and I served as the social media and tech director for the Howie Hawkins campaign. This is part of the Green Socialist Organizing Project's 101 series. These are a recurring series of workshops. We repeat every 3 months. We go Green Party 101, Socialism 101, Organizing 101. So we're in the last session of our second run through. Garrett and I did talk about this before, and I just now realized it. But I would imagine we'll probably keep these fourth Tuesday evenings. It seems to work pretty well. But we will be announcing the next round, making our tweaks and things like that. So to find out more about this ongoing 101 series and the other workshops and podcasts and things that we do with the Green Socialist Organizing Project, you can go to greensocialist.net and sign up to get emails so you know about all this stuff. Watch old episodes of things and all that kind of stuff. So Garrett, you are actually in charge of the slideshow controls, so I will let you introduce yourself, and then we can get rolling.
Yeah, great. So hi everyone. My name is Garrett Wasserman, and I'm a current co-chair of the Green Party of the United States, as well as the Green Wave team lead in our Green Party of Pennsylvania. So I've been active with a lot of stuff lately around organizing. So it's cool that we're talking about organizing tonight. Without a whole lot of further ado, I'll just kick off our presentation here. As Chris said, I'm driving the controls here. So, tonight we're talking about Organizing 101. This isn't meant to be comprehensive. There's obviously a lot that goes into it, but that's partly why you join an organization such as, the Green Socialist Organizing Project or the Green Party, so that you can learn more from, the wisdom of folks who have been doing this for a long time. But what we hope is that, this presentation will get you started if you're, new to organizing, particularly political organizing, around political issues or campaigns, and you're not really sure where to start. We hope that this 101 will give you some ideas on how to get started and, what we mean by organizing, so that you can begin to think about it yourself and how to get started in your community, and how to, if there's existing organizations, how to get involved with them. All right, so, before we get into too much, we kind of have to talk about what the term organizing actually means. And there's a lot of different viewpoints on this, but we're going to give a few different quotes to give a few different perspectives to kind of get us in the right mindset for thinking about this. One comes from a classic, which is Saul Alinsky, who wrote Rules for Radicals, which was very influential on many community organizing efforts over the last few decades. And he says in the book, we're concerned when it comes to organizing, we are concerned with how to create mass organizations to seize power and give it to the people, to realize the democratic dream of equality, justice, peace, cooperation, equal and full opportunities for education, full and useful employment, health, and the creation of those circumstances in which man can have the chance to live by values that give meaning to life. So this is kind of a long quote, but you get the idea here, right? The point of organizing is to essentially create democracy and to create a better life for everyone, right? To create the kind of society we want to live in. We're facing a lot of challenges right now, whether it be, folks who have trouble just finding jobs, just putting food on the table, just keeping a roof over their heads. People, it's hard to afford education. it's hard to get health care if you have any serious health issues. There's a lot of these things. And of course, we face systemic racism and all. You don't want to put just economic issues, right? There's racism, there's sexism. We're seeing, gender oppression and transphobia and things rise right now. There's a lot of issues that we're facing, and we want to create a better progressive type of society where everyone can live the best life that they can, right? And I think that's what this organizing quote is getting toward.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Chris.
If you want to go back to it real quick, yeah. I think it's, we were talking about how we're using these quotes to kind of lay a mindset, right? And I think we can look at recent events, involving Supreme Court decisions to, kind of internalize, take this quote in and think about how we can actually affect change in our community, right? Because for instance, the big one with abortion rights, but Miranda laws got struck down, and school prayer has been weakened, and from what I'm hearing, there's a blow to the EPA on the way. So Roe is the one making the news, but there's been a lot of really bad stuff coming out of the Supreme Court, and depending on where you're watching in terms of what we should be doing in response to it, a lot of it is top down. Vote, 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 vote. Vote Democrat, vote Democrat, vote Democrat. But voting Democrat for decades hasn't actually protected these rights. It just turned them into a good fundraiser, a nice exploited voting, or a nice extortionist voting tactic for them. So if we want to actually change the dynamic, right? If we want to actually forge a new path, which people are very much, from my time working as a community organizer and a field director for a community org, I can tell you from the thousands of doors we knocked that, people are ready for an actual new path, not someone who's going to, do something a little bit different than what we've been experiencing, but something totally different. And what we've been experiencing, the tactics of, top down, at best astroturfed, political organizing has failed on the left, almost across almost all issues. We keep seeing it. So I think when, if we really want to create a society that has equality, justice, peace, cooperation, everything in this quote, we kind of have to have a complete shift in mindset, right? Towards organizing as the solution. Bottom up, building power in our communities, building relationships in our communities, not hoping that the people who most of the time play the role of our oppressors will suddenly be our saviors. So I think that this quote right now in this time, when we're seeing some of the things that we're doing, and it really does kind of feel hopeless for a lot of people in many ways. Our response to that needs to be to radically rethink what we've been doing, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. And Alinsky, there's plenty of criticisms and critiques one could have about Alinsky's model. It was a very, confrontational, aggressive model, and it came from a very specific point of view. But this quote, I think, is really important to try to reorient. How do we achieve these things? We achieve them through organizing. We achieve them through, bringing our communities together. Not necessarily, and that can include electing better people. But if all we're trying to do is elect better people into the same two parties that built this problem, that created the mess, we're going to continue to see the same kind of slides and failures in terms of, matching what the public actually want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the key words to kind of take away from this quote are mass organizations. We're talking about bringing together a mass movement, like the entire community, not just parts of it. We're putting power in the people in democratic forms. And so democracy is the other part of it, that we're trying to build true grassroots bottom-up democracy instead of this top-down model that Chris was talking about. So keep those ideas in mind as we go forward with organizing here. So a couple other quotes to kind of set the tone and the mood here, thinking in terms of, again, of mass organizing and democracy. One from the Green Party's own organizational toolkit is a quote: "Organizing means engaging with society. It means doing, not just thinking or talking." So I think it's important to emphasize when we're building a mass movement and democracy, that has to include doing things, not just talking about it, not just thinking about it, not just sharing ideas. It has to actually be being active with your community, engaging with your community in whatever form that might take. And it might take a lot of different forms, as we'll talk about in a moment here. But that engagement and direct action and working together with people in your community is important. The next quote here is from Lee Staples in the book Roots to Power, which is another classic of grassroots organizing. It says, "Organizing is a bottom-up philosophical approach to social change. It's not simply a method to achieve it." So when we're talking about doing, we're also talking about doing within a particular worldview, philosophical approach and model, where we're trying to understand the world and our role in it and how we can recreate society in the way that we want to see it. So it, this is kind of the balance, in my opinion, to the first quote from the Green Party, that we want to act, but we also want to act after doing our research and philosophical thinking about it and strategizing and talking about tactics and stuff like this, right? You don't want to just act for the sake of it, actually build the grassroots democracy, mass organization, all that we want to see that's actually going to change society. The third quote is from Abby Hoffman, that it says, "The key to organizing an alternative society is to organize people around what they can do, and more importantly, what they want to do." And I think this is also an important point to keep in mind, that as we're talking about tactics and strategies and doing and all this stuff, it has to also be what people want to do. It has to be what people want to see in their community. You have to connect with folks and engage with them, right? Engage with society, understand what do they need and what do I need, and talk about it and come up with a plan there to actually achieve that. It's a lot harder to build a movement when you're not engaging folks and you're not engaging them to get active in things that they care about, right? It has to be stuff that they care about, stuff that's actually going to improve society. And
yeah, and with that one, I'm a big Abby Hoffman fan from my youth, but it's really important that we give people a wide range of ways to engage.
Yes.
If all your local has is a business meeting once a month, you are likely excluding most of your potential members, because only a few, only some people aren't going to want to go to a business meeting. They're not going to want to slug through bylaws changes. They're not want to go. They don't want to be
Yes.
involved in that kind of stuff, right? Some people, but they will show up for an education event. They will show up for a community mobilization. They will show up for a community cleanup. They might not knock doors, but they might phone or text bank. They might not show up for everything, but they might run some fire, social media, or graphic design for you, right? And especially when as an eco-socialist party, right, as an anti-capitalist party, building anti-capitalist organizations, the scope of the fight that we have to have is just so huge, right? And Garrett and I, last month, you can find it on YouTube, but in our last eco-socialism 101 workshop, we got into kind of the history and the building to this total capitalism that we have now, where it's permeated almost every aspect of our society, right? So we've got to be able to, within our own organization, allow people to follow their skills, follow their passion, do things that they want to be doing. Because if you show up, if you come in and you're really excited and you get given work that you're not interested in, you're going to be gone pretty soon, right? So we want to make sure that we're, fulfilling people and things like that. And really, because there's such a scope, there's so much work that needs to be done. There's so many areas that we could be functioning, as grassroots organizers, we really need to kind of take this mindset of like, what are you interested in and how can I support you building it? If you get an activist that comes in and they're really fired up about organizing a tenant union, you shouldn't respond to that with, well, we've been kind of focusing on Medicare for all, right? If they're really into getting that tenant union going, you can start laying the groundwork with them, right? It doesn't mean you have to abandon Medicare for all, but if they're ready to pick up a ball and run, but they just need some help, some mentorship, some support, you need to find yourself in a way to do that. The other side of this coin, where we need to provide a plethora of ways, a multiplicity of ways for people to get involved in our organization. We also need to practice, radical solidarity with other organizations on the left, right? Electoralism isn't the end all be all, right? Neither is isolated movement work. We need to, if you have someone who shows up to your meeting and they really want to, work on a Green New Deal, and you have an environmental group, in your town that is doing really great work on it, awesome. You want to be our liaison with them so that we can collaborate more, right? So you want to help us push green ideas into their plans and their strategies and their policies. We need to, instead of fighting over turf and fighting over people, we need to recognize the real enemy, right? In this case, and that's capitalism and the powers that maintain and support it. So we, rather than fighting with each other and running against each other and not letting interpersonal things go, we need to be really good at practicing radical solidarity across the left, where when PSL does something, we show up. When DSA does something, we show up, right? When Answer does something, we show up. When SALT does something, we show up, and we develop a relationship where they show up too. And now we're amplifying each other instead of running in parallel and fighting. And we can start to build the coalitions and the relationships that both interpersonally and organizationally that can help us overcome this, really huge thing that we're trying to do.
Yeah. All right, so we have some quotes and some mindset and all, and so hopefully you have a better idea starting to form about what organizing is here, with our main goals of making, a mass organization and direct democracy, grassroots democracy that's going to change how society functions to create the kind of society we want to live in. Just some kind of terminology here before we go on. And to kind of compare it with other things that you hear about. Chris was talking about top-down stuff a moment ago, right? Top-down with, Supreme Court decisions, right? Go vote, go vote. That's what you hear. That's more of one of these other approaches. And so we want to kind of differentiate. Jane McAlevey, in her book, No Shortcuts, I think lays out a pretty good distinction between these various things. Most of what you hear from organizations are actually a form of either advocacy or mobilizing. Advocacy is when you want to create social change by basically asking others to do stuff, asking the people in power to do things for you. You advocate for your group to them and say, please pass this bill or please pass this law or something like that, right? And so it's very much based in this idea of there being a quote elite, right? Some group of elite professional people who make the decisions and not ordinary people. We're just asking the professional people to do stuff for us. And that's not what we mean by organizing. It's also not what we term mobilizing, which is these a lot of the stuff you see around the Democratic Party. Mobilizing is not meant to build a mass movement. It's not meant to change people's minds. It's not meant to develop community power. It's still meant to just get more Democrats out to the polls to vote, that sort of thing, right? It's still very limited to the types of political structures and hierarchy that exist today, as opposed to building something new and different, building that grassroots democracy that's missing from today's society. And again, that's what organizing is all about. It's building that grassroots alternative to the very top-down formal hierarchy method that you see in advocacy and mobilizing. It's focusing on a mass movement of ordinary people getting involved in their community and making decisions together as a community, instead of representatives and professionals and elite, so to speak, people making decisions supposedly on our behalf. So again, it's that different mindset. We're not just advocating ideas. We're not just mobilizing people to vote or take some action or whatever. Organizing is this mass movement of ordinary people to create actually grassroots democratic structures, which means that we're teaching each other what grassroots democracy means. We're teaching each other how to be, active citizens, so to speak, and teaching each other how to be leaders. Instead of there being professionals that lead for us, we're teaching each other how to lead. We're teaching, all of us leading together. That's what grassroots democracy is about. And as you do that, leaders will naturally emerge from your organizing efforts. If you're doing it correctly, you'll have lots of leaders emerge as they learn, right? As they attend things such as this one-on-one call, right? As people learn skills, they'll naturally take on bigger and bigger organizing projects, and they'll work together with more organizations, and we build bigger movements as we go. So, any comments on that, Chris?
Yeah, just to sorry. I coughed and I lost it.
That's okay.
No, but I think these are, it's a good, there's nothing wrong with advocacy, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with mobilizing, right? And there are some individuals that you will encounter and that you will engage that are only going to ever mobilize, right? They're never going to pick it up and start organizing, but they'll show up to everything, right? So we shouldn't exclude people based on where their level of engagement is. But the idea, what Garrett was saying about organizing at the bottom, throws me back to Abbie Hoffman. He talked about leaderful movements. And when you look at a decentralized grassroots, movement, when you look at anarchist, bottom left organizing projects and things like that, you may not see your traditional hierarchy of power, but there's definitely a natural division of labor, right? Organizers step up, people fall into roles. And then that's when it's really key, right? A key part of organizing is democracy too. Once we start to have these kind of natural leadership roles falling into place, we've got to make sure they're accountable. We've got to make sure that they're, representing the group democratically. I during Occupy, my student group, the Radical Student Union, modeled something we did off of Abbie Hoffman, and that is Abbie Hoffman with the Yippies, YIPP, not hippies. But with the Yippies, the Youth International Party, the YIP, was, who Hoffman primarily was organizing with, which in many ways was more as much a theater group as an activist, orientation. But they would go to protests and they'd give everyone a button that says leader. And it was just a way to symbolize that, the people's movement is powered by the people. And so when our student group showed up to our first Occupy GA, God, it was a decade ago, I can't believe that, but when we showed up, we had buttons that we were able to make on campus for almost no cost. They had our red star and they had the word leader. And we'd give them to people and they would say, we don't have leaders. And we'd point out, if we all wear them, then we're all leaders, right? So that level of ownership is really important to growing an organization. That thinking back to that Abbie Hoffman quote just previously, that's why he wants people to organize around things that they're passionate about, things that tie into their skills, because he wants them to take ownership of it. He would talk about movements as, obviously movements are evolving things, It's just the nature of basically anything societal, but especially something that's trying to change society. It's got to be fluid and shifting. But Abby Hoffman wanted movements that in many ways weren't defined until the people started to define them, until the people engaged started to give them shape. And he very much lived off that mystique of we never know what they're going to do. But yeah, we've got to make sure that we're, finding out where people are and meeting them where they are. And, as we get through to organizers, I always tell a volunteer when I'm working with people with volunteers, I tell people maybe 1 in 10 will, if you can respond immediately, as soon as someone volunteers with your organization, you can respond within minutes, and maybe 1 in 10 will ever respond to you at all, even though they just said they want to help, right? Maybe 1 in 100 will show up and do something, and maybe 1 in 1,000 is going to be your organizer. Somebody that takes charge and starts organizing other people, starts training and developing other people, and starts leading. So, we shouldn't see these as even though they're listed as 3 separate things. I think there's kind of gray areas between them where they overlap, and where we can help progress people, through each phase to get more and more and more engaged. From the point that, with advocacy, it's like they'll share a Facebook post or they'll donate to a project, but if we can move them to actually showing up, which is the mobilizing, we move another level, and then obviously the end goal that's not achievable for everyone is to move them into that organizer goal.
Yeah, and to be clear, advocacy and mobilizing have their tools in your toolkit, and they have their purpose, and they have their times when they're useful. But so many organizations stop there as their only strategy. They say, I do advocacy and that's it. So we want to make sure that we're reaching the level of organizing, and that we have a pathway to get members trained and all to become new organizers as we go. So that'll be something in a slide later on.
So real quick, Scout Trooper on YouTube wants to know, do you think some of the trigger laws regarding abortion will be prevented across the country due to public opinion? And the reason I'm reading it is because I think thinking about things and advocacy, mobilizing, organizing is a good way to kind of evaluate that question. The Democrats are not even trying to mobilize right now, right? They're in a situation where, whether you agree with the political feasibility of things or the tactic or the risks involved with some of the things, there's multiple avenues that the Democrats could take to try to force action on abortion rights. So, and that could be local, that could be federally, or that could be statewide, right? Because that's generally the 2 bodies that are dealing with this. Though now federal's out of the game, right? They just passed it down to states. But federally, the Women's Health Protection Act it's ready, right? It could be voted on and passed right now to federally codify in law rather than legal precedent. But there's a problem with that. For the Democrats to mobilize for that, they have to be able to pass it. Can't. Because frankly, the Democrats fundamentally have never been a pro-choice party. They've been a party that fundraises on pro-choice and that uses as a bludgeon in electoral coercion. But when it comes down to the reality, Joe Biden opposed Roe when it came out. He voted twice to allow states to overturn Roe. In 2016, they ran an anti-choice vice presidential candidate in Tim Kaine, right? The reality is, even though they could pass it today, the Democrats have empowered enough anti-choice Democrats that they can't mobilize people, because they'd be mobilizing the people for something they can't actually achieve. So they went straight to, they've never moved past advocacy. Donate money, vote for us, right? What Scout Troop is asking in many ways is, can we organize around this? I think a lot of the trigger laws, I don't think we'll see them stopped. Michigan's trigger law was from 1931. It's almost 100 years old, and it just, it just kicked in. And I think that's what a lot of them are going to do, is just kick in. I think they'll kick in, and there'll be a bunch of court battles. But how do we actually oppose this? How do you change people's minds and get them to actually overturn these laws? Comes down to organizing, right? Can we fill the Capitol? Can we engage in, mass civil disobedience? Can we shut shit down? Right? Because if those are the kind of things you can do. Can we fill the streets with people, and apply enough political pressure to change the political reality in those states? And I think it varies so much state to state. You look at Arizona, women stormed the Capitol. Tear gas. And so there are definitely states where there's, active confrontation over this. But I don't know that it's going to stop, any of the stuff to go through, right? But yeah, as Scott, Trooper says, public opinion can sway a lot of things, which I absolutely agree with. I think the problem is that these laws were set to go in without any action. So our public opinion is about pushing back and reversing, not so much about trying to stop it from happening in the first place. In the case of the trigger law specifically, and it all comes back to that community engagement thing, right? Access to abortion is a majoritarian position. The most Americans want some level of access to abortion. So both Republicans and Democrats are taking anti-majoritarian positions here. So how do we, turn people out? What does that look like? The organizing look like to overcome it? It's a very big question that I feel like, talking to existing abortion support networks and things like that is the people to be talking to. Right, Garrett and I can probably talk philosophically about it, but I think we're in a position right now where we need to be talking to the people who are doing the work already, and kind of getting some ideas and needs from them. But yeah, very much. And some of it's going to take changes in people, right? Illinois is voting today, and God help us that the Hitler quoting Mary Miller that represents the west side of my town loses. But when you're dealing with people that literally quote Hitler, and she thanked Trump for saving white babies this week, in the case of a Mary Miller, she's just got to go. And and right now, my hope, fingers crossed, is that she goes in her primary and it's not even a thing. But there's a lot of ways we can go about it. But I think with the trigger laws, we just kind of have to accept that they're going to be put in place, and how do we go from there?
Yeah, I think it illustrates essentially what's here, right? Just making your support for abortion rights known is kind of the advocacy level. And, that's not enough when we have representatives that don't listen to us or, are very actively against listening to us, have their own agenda to remove abortion rights. They're definitely not going to listen to us. And the Democrats' response is at best to mobilize to vote Democrat, right? It's only to vote, even though there's many other things that they could be doing. And so our response to that has to be to organize around them, and to do, mass civil disobedience, to hold our protests and rallies and educate others on, ways around it. As Chris said, there's a lot of organizations. I spoke to some abortion workers in Pittsburgh that has suggested, for example, a number of websites like ineedanA.com, where you can learn about abortions. The Plan C pills, I think it's plancpills.org maybe. There's spreading information that we can do to make sure that it's out there. And ultimately, it's including all those people in our movement, right? Talking before you take any radical action. It's talking with those folks on the ground who are most impacted by the decision and who are the workers who are already working on it to formulate a plan together on how to act. So, building our organization and connections, the topic of this is ties into all that, I think. So let's go on here, I guess, right? So some kind of affirmations here about organizing. The first one is you don't need permission to begin organizing. That one I think is important to keep in mind because just like we were saying earlier, mobilizing and advocacy tend to kind of focus on professionals, right? That say that these professionals turn people out or make decisions or write reports or whatever it is. And you don't need to be a professional. You don't need to be an elite. You don't have to have a master's degree or whatever. You just have to be somebody that cares about making your community better. And you can start organizing. Good organizing is built first and foremost on trust and real relationships. If you don't trust each other, if you don't know each other, then you can't really work together. You can't really build an organization together. And a lot of working class people rightfully don't trust politicians because they have been taken advantage of by both Republicans and Democrats for decades. They know that neither of those parties work for them. So they don't trust most politicians. You see people everywhere, they'll even tell you to your face, right? They vote the lesser evil. They're not happy about it. They just don't want things to get worse. So they naturally don't trust politicians or just people that want to organize in the political space at all. So it's very important that as we're organizing, the first thing we work on is building that trust and building that relationship. That I'm
showing
not
up for them.
Yeah. What's that?
Right? Like, what are their problems and how can you help them?
Exactly.
Not coming in and telling them what they need to do to change their community.
Yeah, and it starts with listening to them. That we'll have a slide on that, deep canvassing in a minute. Another important point is to not let yourself get overwhelmed. There are plenty of things going on in your city, in your state, in the country, internationally, globally. There's a lot to worry about. As an organized movement, we can eventually tackle all of those things, but you're not going to do that by yourself today. So don't let yourself get overwhelmed. It's okay to start with one or two things that are important in your community and build from there. Make sure you do prep work and planning. So that's part of our organizing talk here today. That for you to have effective organizing and to develop effective actions, you should have a plan in place. You should know what your goals are, what your action is going to be, and what your expected outcome is. And you should be able to kind of measure that, to have some kind of metric or whatever. Do you want a certain number of signatures, a certain number of people to join the organization? You want a law to pass, whatever it is. You should have some kind of metric so you can determine if your action was successful. Because obviously, if you're successful, that's great. And you can keep building from there. But even if you're not successful, you want to make sure that you can learn from what happened, right? And you can try again in a different way the next time.
And it's good to have, you want to make sure that your goals and your metrics are concrete, right?
Yeah.
That they're achievable, right? I've met people who literally were like, we just need to get world peace. Like, this is a nebulous global thing that you just said, and you just set yourself up with a first out of the gate goal that is vague and unspecific and likely unachievable in our life, in any short term, maybe even world peace, whatever that means, is likely a generational type of conversation. So you want to make sure that you're being realistic about your capacity, being realistic about what you're trying to do, and work from there. An example I have is one of my friends wanted to get in, and this was back a decade ago in the beginning of the Fight for 15 movement. He wanted to organize for, unions in fast food places. And I mean, at the time, there was zero support from established unions, right? He was going to have to go the IWW route with independent NLRB elections and things like that. And what we kind of came down to, and he actually ended up moving and it all kind of fizzled, when it lost its leader. But what we ended up coming down to was that rather than trying to unionize, having the goal be to unionize every fast food restaurant in town, which is where it started, right? It started with a young organizer in his early 20s who wanted to change the world. And so he had this big goal. But the big goal was too much for one person. It was too, and so our step to get there was that it'd probably be easier to pass, say, a municipal law on the city level saying that all businesses within city limits had to provide 5 free sick days. And that gives our work, our service industry workers, organization a win. And now they say, hey, these guys actually just got us free sick days. Like, maybe we should talk to them when they're talking, listen a little more when we're talking about unions, or maybe you weren't taking seriously. You were just another white kid organizer that came in and tried to change things, right? And I'm speaking specifically of this one organizer, but if you can achieve that, if you can come up with a plan, an escalation, right? You start and you build. You don't start with going straight to blowing up the press, blowing up social media and causing chaos, right? You escalate your way up to these things so that you can build your own narrative and things like that. So that's a super important part of trying to figure all that stuff out.
Yep. So metrics are really important to make sure that you're staying on track with your organizing work. And the last 2 points here on this slide kind of go together. The first one is that everything we talk about tonight may or may not necessarily apply to your community. There is no one true method to organize. There's lots of different ways to do it. And so the best thing you could do is learn and see lots of examples of how other people have done it in their communities. And kind of pick and choose, take the things that make sense for your community, and adapt them and see how it goes in your community. And that particularly goes for independent political organizing, such as a Green Party. The organizing advice that does exist tends to be for like nonprofit work around some particular issue or whatever. It tends to stay away from the political angle. So especially when it comes to political organizing, not only is there no one method, but it's also somewhat difficult to even find resources about it. And so, of course, that's partly why Green Socialist Organizing Project exists, and we're doing things like this 101 and all to try to put together resources that can help you and to give you ideas how to get started political organizing in your community. All right, so one model, and again, lots of models, but one model you might consider for starting a new local organizing, and let me make sure that's not in the way. Okay, is this 4-phase model, and to be honest, I forget exactly where I found it. So if someone knows, we'll put a link to the thing, to the source. But I like this 4-phase model as a way of kind of starting a new Green Party chapter in your community. So what your organization does is it goes through essentially 4 initial phases, and then you're kind of a real organization, so to speak, right? You're doing real organizing work. You start with a groundwork phase where before you even start taking action, you have to know your turf. You have to know the community that you want to organize. So you need to learn more about your community. Who are the people with power? Who are the people that make decisions in your community? Whether that's elected officials or if big nonprofit organizations or anything like that. And you want to talk to people in the community to try to find out what are the existing issues, what are the things that are not being addressed. What are the trends, the political trends that are going on? Is your community suddenly a bunch of people became libertarians or something, right? It's you want to know more about your community before you get started so that you can adjust your strategy as necessary. The second phase is you of course start your organizing committee. So that's you and a couple of people who might be initially interested in starting, get together and set some initial goals, pick 1 or 2 issues like we said that you want to focus on organizing around. And you start talking to folks in the community. You start building trust, like we were saying, right? You start talking to people and asking, what are the issues that they're concerned about? What are, what do they want to see done in the community? And if they join the organization, what can we organize together to make that happen? That eventually turns into the third phase, which is a general recruitment drive. After you've kind of recruited your initial organizers, you want to reach out to the larger community. So that's doing, door knocking, community meetings, all that stuff to make sure that you're learning more about what people want, but also letting them know that you exist, that you have a plan that's coming together, and you're inviting them to come join in making that plan and building that organization. And then finally, your fourth phase here is when you form it, your kind of full established organization, right? You set this is where it starts to get the more of the business meeting type stuff, right? Like you set your bylaws, you set your goals, you maybe elect leadership, depending on what type of things you're going for. You pick your candidates to run for office, and then you go from there. So by the time you've reached that point, you have a kind of fully developed organization to keep up your organizing efforts. So I think this is kind of a good way to think about getting started. That you want to go through the groundwork, recruiting, and then eventually forming your organization.
Yeah, and when you're doing your groundwork, you can to kind of tie. So the elephant in the room with political organizing is kind of social media, right? And the major parties have kind of gone to I don't know if this is a proper term for it, but a media-based electoral strategy. Republicans do it more than Democrats in my experience, but Republicans and Democrats are not knocking doors in their community as the key driver of electoral campaigning. It's about Facebook ads, it's about YouTube videos, it's about mailers and all the things that text blasts. The Republicans in Illinois think that I'm someone else who's not me, and no matter how many times I've told them that it's not me, they keep sending me texts. So now they're getting an angry socialist responding. But the mainstream politics has moved away from interpersonal politics, where you talk to directly to people in your community about the issues. It's all turned one directional, them telling you what to think, telling you who to vote for. So they've moved very much into social media. What I tell people when I do social media workshops is if your social media is not tied into an on-the-ground organization, it's useless. It's sending people into a void. It's recruiting someone who can't be engaged and moved up the ladder to further engagement. So when you're doing your groundwork, that doesn't mean, you can use social media to help you learn what the key things are, right? This is when you have issues surveys, right? You can have one on social media, and you can have one when you're knocking doors. The simple one we used throughout the Holly Hawkins campaign was, what are your top 3 issues, right? And they'd give them to us, and then they'd all get broken down, and we'd see where people were at. I'll say in the Holly Hawkins campaign, those surveys completely, they told us that we were right on track with our messaging and our focus in terms of our base, right? Because that's who you talk to generally with social media, is your base. When you go into the recruitment drive, right, and you've gone through your organizing committee, you've kind of selected your initial issues and goals, right? So your issue is, you want to deal with this environmental problem in your town. In my town down the street, we have an old Pillsbury plant that's full of asbestos. Somebody literally tried to tear it down decades ago and covered half the town in asbestos dust. And there's constant conversations about what to do with it. It's an abandoned Pillsbury mill where they used to make rolls and everything. So if that's my issue, I can use social media to have a petition that says, we need to put in a solar panel plant there instead of, whatever horrible thing our neoliberal city council is going to do, right? And you can use, this is the point where you start like casting this wide non-branded net. Are you interested in this issue? Not, this is where we're at on it. not the Greens are going to solve the problem, but are you is this a concern to you? And then that, once you start getting those people, those are kind of your low-hanging fruit when you're doing a recruitment drive, right? You contact all those people, start talking to them about solutions, start talking about independent organizing, trying to get them engaged and involved in the organization, right? And obviously, social media can be used for all kinds of promotion and education and things like that too. But that's grassroots as a smaller, third party, as a grassroots third party. We need to expand our base. We need access to the people that we aren't already connected to, and that's where social media can come in. It can't be, this kind of organizing can't be run completely from digital platforms. There's got to be some real world stuff that it plugs into.
All right, so so we have this 4-phase model here that you can think about to get started. The rest of this presentation is pretty much going to be talking about these 4 phases with some extra references and stuff. So let's kind of go through them. So the first part with kind of your groundwork, you're doing your background research. You want to know more about your community. You want to know about the history of the community. How long has that community been there? What are the demographics? What things have existed before? Was there a Pillsbury plant, or was there a steel industry or something, right? You want to know the history of your town and what happened there. Because that could kind of influence, for example, I lived around Pittsburgh in a huge steel industry, right? So I kind of have to keep in mind that a lot of, especially the elder folks in this area, are used to steel industry stuff. So you kind of have to talk about that when you're talking to them. They're thinking of the heyday of steel, and steel is gone, and we don't have that. And we don't really want dirty industry like that anyway. There's better ways to produce steel now, in addition to, all kinds of other green industry. But knowing that history allows you to talk to them better, relate to them better, and relate to their experiences better, and build trust and all the stuff we talked about. You'll want to do this power mapping exercise, sort of where you understand, once you know more about the history and the demographics and who's there, you can ask these questions about what are the connections between all the elected officials, between all the decision makers in your community, all the community organizers, community leaders, maybe churches or something in your area, right? If there's a particularly influential church or something, you want to know who all these people are, who all these organizations are, and what the relationships are, right? Some of them might work together, some of them might be more hostile to each other, some of them might give money to each other, right? It's important to know these things so that when you're deciding what to do with your advocacy, mobilizing, organizing campaigns, you know who influences who, right? And who to talk to be on your side, and so to speak, what you're up against, right? who are the people that are supporting the thing that you don't want to happen. So there's a lot of ways to find this information. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
When it comes to power mapping, I think you want to do 2 power maps, right? You want to do your community power map, which is what Garrett's been talking about, right? Who are the decision makers? Who are the people? Who are the activists and organizations that are on the ground doing the work already? Right? And that can be important because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So who can we work with on things? We're really interested in this issue. Let's talk to this organization. Let's partner up from some actions. Let's share the workload. Let's spread it off the, with any kind of small organization like this, it's usually filled with overworked organizers, overspread, overextended organizers. So you do that, and it can help you, really understand your town and how it works. One thing that's not on there that I talk about on all of these is, in a lot of our communities, there's no community left. The idea of a neighborhood, the idea of a community, an integrated community is kind of gone. My mom lived in suburbs, and didn't know and didn't like most of her neighbors. They'd never really spoken, they didn't interact with one another. But especially in working class communities, there are often still very much a vibrant, community life. And what I always tell people when they're, knocking doors in the community is, you don't want to know who the precincts and committee person is necessarily. You want to know who the block mop is. Who's the person that knows everybody? Who's the person that if you build that real relationship with, 30 people come with her because they trust her. Right, and it doesn't have to be a mom. This is, that's just a term. But who is that person? Who's the anchor of the community? Because oftentimes it's not the person with official power. That person with official power is often a problem for the people that actually do exercise a level of social power within the community. And the other kind that's, you do that community type things. You can kind of plot out who are you going to work with, what are your stumbling blocks going to be, and then you do a personal power map, right? Who do I know? How many degrees away from this decision maker are we in our organization, right? I live in a somewhat smaller, I live in a town of 100,000. I grew up in a town of 2,500, but in those situations, it's a little easier to know people. But when you're in a city like Pittsburgh, right, you may just know who this key person you need. There could be an organizing superstar that you just know of by reputation. Well, who knows him? Who knows her, right? And you start doing these power maps and you find out like, well, shit, my son goes to daycare with their niece, and now all of a sudden we know a direct route. Like, how can we go talk to this person directly? How can we do that kind of engagement? So once you kind of get that power map picture of your community, do your individual power map, right? And that individual power map will come in really big handy when it comes to the door knocking and growing your organizational structure and in growing your organization, because that will give you your initial people you go talk to. Right? Part of that power map is saying, make a list of every single person you know that would generally support the issues you're working on, and you can start talking to them. Right? So you want to do, it's like a double map. Well, a micro and a macro map is exactly what it is. A community and a personal.
Yeah.
And then you kind of like put them both on transparent paper, right, and overlay them and see where your connections are. And you may really want to work on this issue, and you do your power map and you find out, what, we're not connected on that issue. We need to build relationships there, but we're ready to roll on this other issue. Where when we did our power map, we found out that we've got a lot of connections into the existing movement, and we can pretty easily move in and with trusted relationships. So it can help your prioritization for sure too.
Yeah. Having the map helps a lot to, to organize people, to figure out who you need to talk to, and also to help decide with your messaging. So, I give some examples here. There's plenty of other places that you can learn. Oh, what happened here? Participants can see your application. Oh, I don't know what happened, whatever. Anyway, there's lots of places you can find power mapping data, but for example, if you're looking at political campaigns, if you're looking at elected officials, they probably filed some kind of financial report with either the state, if they ran for local or state office, or the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, if they're, a Congress member. So you can look up their financial contributions and see who contributes to them, both individuals and PACs, right? So you can get a sense of what industries support them, for example.
An example of that, would be, so let's say you're starting a Green Party and you're in an area where, to your knowledge, there's been no Green Party, right? So the network isn't there already. But we have presidential elections, we have things like that, right? So you can go and pull your FEC list and filter through that and find out who in my county donated to Howie in 2020, who donated to Jill in 2016, who donated to Jill in 2012, right? Who donated to Bernie, right? Because there's some overlap with our issues there. So you can use those FEC reports to kind of build your list. I know someone who organizes, and they like to talk about how deep red of a location they're in.
Mhm.
But the reality is, and I got mad one day and I went online and I looked it up after the 2016 election, and I said 5,000 people in your county voted for Jill. You're not alone. You just have
Right.
to find them, right? Another way, I just got these yesterday from the Illinois Board of Elections, voter data, right? On this little tiny flash drive is the contact information for every registered voter in a U.S. congressional district in Illinois. On this one is every single voter in Cook County, which is where Chicago is. If I went downstairs, I've got one for every single district in a suburban congressional district, right? And as a political party in Illinois, we get it for free. We fill out a form and they call me and I go and I pick up these flash drives. And now we know who's registered in our districts. We can see their past primary votes and things in Illinois, and what data you'll get differs from state to state. But it's one of the benefits of actually being official. And contacting your state party and getting support there is that they may have or be able to access voter lists as a party or a candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, voter lists, FEC or state data, tax filings, all that stuff can kind of help find out more information about political campaigns, voters, nonprofits that are in your area. You might also want to partner with labor unions. You can look up labor unions that are registered near you through the Federal Labor Relations Board, for example. If the coffee shop had a union vote recently, you can look at their filing for that. And of course, you can find lots of statistics from the U.S. Census, for example, to get a sense of, how many people live in your area and where they live at, and what's the average median salaries in your area and things like that, so that you can kind of customize your message.
General past election data is also really good, right? If you're going to run for city council, one of the first things you should know is, on average, how many votes do I need to win? And you can find that out by looking at past elections, see how many votes were cast on average over a few elections, how many votes the winner got over a few elections. And then that can help you start to set the metrics that we talked about earlier, right? Okay, I need 1,000 votes. How many doors do I need to knock to get that, do I think? It can help you qualify your need, help you figure out, actually define what you need to achieve to have success. And also always remember, success doesn't always mean winning. If your organization grew and is stronger after a political campaign, even though you lost, there's success there.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of ways to define success, and as third-party candidates and third-party organizers, we're playing on a rigged field, right? The major parties have very much written repression into the law. Today, like I said, today was voting day in Illinois. I couldn't vote. Greens are banned from participating in the state primaries, and they didn't have a nonpartisan ballot when I walked into the precinct. They said you can choose Republican or Democrat, and I walked out, right? Because I'm not either one of those things. So we've got to have a little bit of realism in terms of addressing or acknowledging the material conditions that we're organizing under, and setting our goals appropriately. And then apparently for the last point, I jumped the gun and did that a little early.
Yeah, and a lot of times, especially when it comes to campaigns, historical data shows that a lot of times, it seems pretty simple, but like the candidate that's most well known is probably the one that's going to win, because people are not happy with Republicans and Democrats. They want to vote for something else. It's really like a numbers game. It's getting enough people to know that you exist and that you're an alternative that you win. And so a lot of Greens, let's say, will not win their first campaign for office, but they'll win the second or third time that they run, because nobody knew who they were the first time. But that first campaign got, a third of the community to know who they are. And they started to build trust. They started to build connections, so that the second time they ran, they had those connections from the go. And so now they could win. Now they had that. So we have to keep that in our organizing mindset, that it takes time to build any organizing movement.
Yeah, and so something I just thought about when you were talking about that, and it kind of comes down to qualifying the lead. Who are we actually trying to talk to, right? Who are we trying to build a base from? And one of the things that, as independent socialist organizers, we should look for are the people that aren't included in the voter data, right? The largest voting block every election is non-voters, and in most elections, they're a majority. And I can tell you from the political behavior, the normal political behavior of Republicans and Democrats, they aren't talking to non-voters. Democrats, when you get a walk list from a Democratic Party operative, it mainly includes strong Democratic supporters. They're only trying to turn out their own base. And the same goes for the Republicans, right? And that leads to the distrust in working class, because most of these non-voters are, probably in working class communities. And it leads to the rightful distrust of politicians. So when you're pulling your voter data, as Greens, one thing we should be saying is, where are the areas where the fewest number of people voted, right? And that's an organizing opportunity for us. Because if it's an area that 70% of the people voted either Republican or Democrat, there's a much smaller piece of the potential pie that we can get into, right? They're already spoken for. So when we get this kind of data, you want to be looking at, the positive stuff for you in there, but you also want to be looking at the negative space. You want to be looking for the holes. Because if you could, Sherry Hunkala in Philadelphia, in her district, in her state house district, when she ran in, I think it was 28, might have been 2017 because it was a special election, but her district, 0 people voted for Trump. 0 people voted for Trump. I don't know the stats, but I would bet that their voter turnout is probably around 30% in that district, maybe, right? And she almost won with the write-in campaign, right? They had to kick her off the ballot using the shenanigans that the Democrats of Pennsylvania are known for. They literally lied to her. They told her all of her paperwork was in, and then when they were like, "Oh, we don't have this one," but they waited till the day after it could be turned in to say it, kicked her off the ballot, right? But it's a working class community that Sherry's been organizing in her entire life. And she sees it as an opportunity, whereas Republicans and Democrats see those empty spaces, those non-voting communities, as black hole, spaces to be avoided. They ignore them and write them off. So as Greens and as independent socialist organizers, we want to be looking for those places where people aren't participating right now. The people who have refused to participate in their own oppression. It's a key organizing area that we need to see.
Yeah. So, one way that we can reach these non-voters is the second thing on here. When we're doing our groundwork research, there's a lot that goes into power mapping. We also want to start doing surveys and reaching out to people in the community, the actual people that work there, live there, and finding out what are the issues that they're concerned about. What are the things that they want to see action on that we can maybe work with them on. So, there's a bunch of ways to do it. You could do mailers and phone calls and all, but door knocking is the best way to have that deep conversation that's going to build trust. So you can go to their door and ask them a few questions. But you could potentially mail it to them. You could post a survey on social media, depending on what you're going for. The main thing is just making sure that your survey is asking the appropriate questions to get the feedback you actually need to take action. Sometimes folks will ask these really rigged questions, right? And it's not useful to understanding how the community actually feels about issues. You want to make sure that it's open enough that they can talk about things that they want, and it's not just confirming what you think they want. So we'll come back to surveys in a moment here. Our phase 2 that we were talked about was an organizing committee. So once you kind of have a sense from your groundwork research of what people are interested in and what organizations exist already and that sort of stuff, you could begin to think about, okay, what is my organization? What is my local Green Party going to stand for? What is going to be its major organizing point, at least to start with? So Lee Staples' book, which we mentioned earlier, has a few ideas around it, or about starting out. So, for example, what are you organizing around? Is it around turf? Which is a particular community? Are you organizing around a particular issue? Are you organizing around some identity? Or you're organizing around a workplace? So that would be like union organizing, which is a little bit out of scope for what we're talking about with political organizing here, but it is related because we, of course, should work with unions and workplaces and all as part of a mass movement.
I'd also say too that there's while our capacity might not allow us to do it right now, there's a major vacuum in especially lower level service industry, workplace organizing, right? My brother-in-law a while back worked for a sandwich shop, and I was at my mother-in-law's picking my son up, and he came in and he looked at me and he said, "Chris, help me start a union." Now, he was fired 2 days later, and it wasn't because he said, "Chris, help me start a union." There were other things going on, but that led him to want a union, and led to his firing eventually. But my response was to give him some basic advice and then reach out to my labor contacts. And I live in a state capital. Every single major union that operates within the state of Illinois has an office in my town. When I talked to the former president of the Trades and Labor Association that I've organized with for a decade, he told me there's not a single union in town engaged in service industry organizing. They're all here, and none of them are engaging our local service industry. So it's probably not the best place to start, right? Because it's a big thing. But I do think even as political organizers, even as green organizers, we need to recognize that gap, that void, the vacuum that exists in workplace organizing. And when we look also at the successes and failures in workplace organizing in recent years, big unions trying to go into Bessemer, Alabama and run a top-down outside organizer ran union drive may or may not have failed depending on the level of non-tomfoolery that Amazon got down to, right? But when the vote came out, they failed. It didn't work, and we can absolutely have real legitimate discussions about whether they really failed or whether Amazon broke the law. But where we saw a success organizing Amazon was bottom-up independent organizing, right? So we shouldn't leave the workplace organizing to these behemoths. I often call most of our major unions in the United States, I often call them collaborationist unions. They no longer fight capital. They've kind of forgotten what their purpose was, and it's led to a major degradation of unions in the United States. And it's not every union, and it's certainly not all the membership, but they've gotten a very top. Many of the major national unions have become very top down and top heavy. They're more worried about colas than organizing in the workplace. So I think because of that, we should see the vacuum, and we should also be wary of leaving it to people that have to organizations that have a fundamentally different viewpoint, in terms of what we're trying to build and how we should do this work.
Yeah, for sure. When we talk about unions and workplace organizing here, we're for sure talking about, a radical, anti-capitalist, eco-socialist sort of organizing. And unfortunately, a lot of the, especially older unions, have been essentially captured by capital and the Democratic Party at this point. So I think it is important for us to support workplace organizing through our green parties. But, political organizing is also more than just workplaces. So, depending on what you want to focus, it might depend a little bit on your community and what your community needs are. And, that's setting your initial goals here, which, at the bottom, the best way to think about what your goals are is to think about sentences in the form, who wants what from whom, and how can we accomplish it? And if you kind of if you make sure that all your goals are in that format, that'll help you very clearly decide what your goals are and, how you're going to actually get to it, right? If you can't put it in that format, I should say, then that might be too abstract of a goal, right? You want to make sure it's something very concrete that you can put in this format so that you know how to start working toward accomplishing it. The who is your membership, your organization, and also, in conjunction with your allies, in consultation with your allies. The what is, of course, the goal, the thing that you want to do, and the whom is who you're acting toward or against, or whatever the appropriate term is. It could be individuals, it could be like elected officials, or whatever, or it could just be institutions in general, that we might want to replace certain institutions with other ones. Maybe there's some nonprofit or something that's not doing what we want, and we want to create a new nonprofit that's actually going to do the thing that we want and be grassroots democratic and accountable and all this stuff. So think of your goals in terms of the structure, and it'll help you decide on good concrete goals that you can actually start working on.
And it'll also, once you know who can affect change, that'll tell you what kind of tactics, what kind of escalations work, right?
Yes.
If getting a law passed by your city council and getting a policy changed by Ameren are totally different tactically, right? Enough negative PR pressure on a corporation, a CEO unilaterally can change a policy.
Right.
Whereas if you're talking about passing a law, or passing a measure in your city council, now we're talking about whipping votes, counting votes, making talking to the people and making sure you're gonna cross that threshold. So you definitely want to make sure knowing who you're going to ask. We can really change things. Related, experience I had was that when I worked for the community organization that I worked for, we were doing a community cleanup in one of our neighborhoods called the Park District. They said, cool, we'll drop a trailer full of chainsaws and bags, and grabbers and gloves, and everything, lawnmowers, everything you would need to clean up around this park and the alleys. We'll have it there in the morning. What time do you want it unlocked? What time do you want us to come back and lock it? Park District was amazing, right? So we were ready to go. We told the community that we're going to do it. We've got the resources we need to actually achieve it. So we called Public Works and we said, hey, we're cleaning up the alleys for you because it's your job and you don't do it. Where do we put the trash? And they basically said, that's your problem. So that led to, us trying to get them to change their mind, which didn't work. The head of Public Works never bent, no matter how many times I called and emailed him and pushed. He never once bent on helping us get rid of the trash that frankly is his trash. These were neighborhoods in working class parts of the town that he didn't have the budget to actually do the work in and serve. So I talked about escalation earlier, right? You ask nicely first. And then when you get mad, they can't say, well, you just came in here screaming. It's like, no, I asked you nicely first. And then I came in here screaming. And then when it still didn't work, I called him the day before the cleanup and he didn't answer. And I left a message and I said, okay, so the cleanup's happening on Saturday. You have until tomorrow to tell me where I'm going to put this trash. If you continue to say that this is my problem, Where I'm going to take the trash is City Hall at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, right before City Council. We're going to dump it all in front of City Hall. We're going to do a press conference, and we're going to talk about how you didn't, how Public Works wasn't helping us on this. I had a voicemail within a half an hour telling me the specific city-owned lot where we could put all the trash and it would be picked up by Monday because he did not want it to be sitting there Tuesday to give us that opportunity to publicly embarrass him. Right. And that's kind of what Scout Trooper was talking about earlier in terms of public opinion and public pressure. Right. So we actually shifted who could make the decision. Right. We started by asking Public Works and working through their leadership. But when their leadership didn't give us anyone, we went above their head. And the threat of embarrassing them to their bosses had an immediate result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that story. Yeah, so that's I think this is a good structure on how to think about your goals, and like Chris said, those goals can shift over time. These are only initial goals. You should definitely revise them based on material conditions on the ground and as more people come in. But this is a good way to structure them to make sure that you're sticking with concrete goals and you're not getting too abstract and weird and unobtainable. Let's see. I had 5 questions from this book, Unapologetic, by Charlene Carruthers, which I thought was a pretty good way of thinking about organizing too. And in particular, thinking about organizing to win, so to speak, to actually make change. And it's to ask about your organization. First, who am I? What do I bring to the organization? What do I bring to the organizing work? 2, who are my people? So who are the people that I support in solidarity? But also, who are the people that hold me accountable? Because if no one holds me accountable, then I'm not actually organizing with anybody, right? I'm just doing my own thing by myself. You want to be organizing as part of a community. The third one is that what do we want question. And it can encompass a lot of things, but we're looking at transformative change, which is a shared vision of how we're going to alter the structures of power that exist today. So it's building that grassroots democracy again. That's at the heart of what we want. And pretty much all these questions, how do we empower people to make the changes that we want to see, right? And that kind of leads into number 4 here, which is what are we building? We want to make sure that we're building our institutions in a way that gives power to our communities, gives grassroots democracy to our communities. And building power is the ability to act and get what you want. And, Chris gave a good illustration of having power to some degree, at least. You want it to be a little bit more democratic than that, but, you get the idea, right? When you organize and you act together and you take the appropriate actions, you can make things happen.
Well, and in that case, we were able to weaponize someone else's power.
Yeah, that's probably the better way to put it. Yeah.
Right. We were able to turn one part of city government against the other in terms of city council is very much concerned about PR and does not want a press conference with trash dumped in front of City Hall. Right. So we were able to weaponize that. I mean, it's like on Twitter. Because I'm a former GPUS co-chair, I got that blue check that makes me official, and I mainly weaponize it against companies when I'm not happy with them. They see that, they see that blue check and they respond very, very quickly. So sometimes, it's not about wielding your own power. It's about figuring out how to manipulate the power that already exists within your community to achieve your goals. It is possible to not have the power, but still wield it.
Yeah. And one thing I particularly like about what this book says about building is that education, both self-education and collective education, is a very critical component of building. You have to be learning yourself, always learning, reading books, whatever, and learning from your actions too, learning from trying to do things in practice and seeing what worked and what didn't work and learning from that. And also sharing with each other as a collective educational effort. Again, maybe reading groups, but also by doing collective action, you learn from your both your victories and your losses, from the successes and the mistakes, and you learn together. You teach each other those things so that you can always be doing more. I think that's an
and that
important part of building.
the collective education, in my opinion, is the most underlooked part of building, and a big part of it is because most issue advocacy groups and things like that are tethered to a Democratic Party. They don't want they want a total line membership, right? That will do as they're told when the time comes. But for an independent organization to sustain over time, to avoid fracture and splintering, having that collective education is really important, because it helps you build a common worldview, a common vision. You don't have to agree on everything, right? But when you've gone through this kind of process, it makes it a lot easier to democratically weather disagreement and things like that, because you understand where people are coming from, even if you don't necessarily agree with them, because you've had this common, collective education experience, whether that be, educational programs, reading groups, reading lists that everyone's working through, or practical real world experiences that help you come together. So, it's why both Garrett and I are heavily focused on education right now. And I think, honestly, I'll say, I think Bernie's campaign is a really good example of the danger that can come from not doing this work. Had this kind of work been centered on, throughout his campaign, maybe it doesn't fracture when he drops out, and maybe there's a real Dem exit, maybe there's a real, movement that comes out with it. But because everything he's doing was feeding back into the Democratic Party, it didn't do it. And then the other side of that is, a lot of misinformation can come out. A lot of lack of political foundation can create a whole lot of problems as your organization grows and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we saw the Bernie campaign, suddenly explode to huge heights, where it was, the top front runner against the establishment candidate. And then it also very quickly disappeared after Bernie endorsed, Clinton and then Biden, of course, because there was no educational component to continue it on. There was no radical component to continue it on. So that, it's important that in our organizing, we continue things on, and we think from the very beginning how we can integrate education into our goals and into our structures, because, this is a long haul push, as we talked about in eco-socialism and all, right?
And
The toppling capitalism is a long,
there's a lot of bad habits and shit we all got to break too, right? If we're gonna buck the traditional top-down authoritarian organizing model that permeates American politics, right? We kind of have to break down, our habits and our perceptions, and be able to, that kind of education component is really important for allowing people this space to understand how to actually form a truly different path, to really go a truly different direction. And we said it in eco-socialism, and the Green Party went both, right? Like, if we're just 1% left of the left flank of the Democratic Party, what are we doing, right? And it's one of the failures of the Green Party, is that it has historically seen the left flank of the Democratic Party as its primary organizing and recruitment location. But that brings in a lot of people, a lot of new organizers with a lot of baggage, because they've been socialized and conditioned within the Democratic Party. So, it's really key in so many issues to have that collective education.
Yes.
and the
And
support to do it, right?
mhm.
Like leftists historically just yell, go read a book, right? And it's like, so you give them a book, but they
Right,
need
right.
someone to help them. Most people need someone to help them through it. Most leftist philosophy is not overly accessible. Most leftist philosophy, a lot of the things that people yell at you to read, like Lenin's State and Revolution, for example, is very applicable, but you have to be able to transcribe it over a century, right, in the modern times and modern conditions, and apply it in different ways than it might have originally been made. So, that collective aspect can help us all help each other through.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is what our new podcast that we're coming out with is going to kind of try.
Yay. Yes. More educational stuff. So I think all this kind of leads into the last question here, which is, are we actually ready to win? And I like this quote: if we're not ready to govern, then we're not ready to win. And it pulls into this idea of democracy and self-determination, that, let's say a campaign for office, that we win that office, that Green gets elected. Okay, now you're in a position of power to make decisions, and people are looking to you to make those decisions, to fulfill the promises that we talked about. So you have to be ready to do those things and to fight for them. And, we have to be ready for that in our education, in our institutions. When we get people elected, most likely, if you just get, Congress is a great example. There's 435 representatives, right? So even if, 20 Greens win in Congress, just this amazing landslide of Greens, right? Like 20 of them, which is like bigger than the squad or whatever, right? in the Democrats. 20 out of 435 is not going to suddenly pass a whole bunch of legislation, right? Where their power comes in is that they can try to leverage if there's small gaps between, Republicans and Democrats and all. But I think in particular, it's their ability to mobilize. Now they're all of a sudden national actors, national figures that can mobilize people out to Washington, D.C. and say, we want this particular bill passed, and we're going to, be here until that happens. Once you become a national figure like that, you can really drive so much more organizing potential. But you got to be ready to do those things. You have to have all the infrastructure. You have to have the connections. You have to have the grassroots democratic organizational structure that allows people to participate in your campaign and to be involved in your campaign. And once you get elected, to be involved beyond that point, right? To make sure that you're accountable to the promises that you made before you got elected, right? All of these things have to be in place in order for us to really win, and in order for us to really build on that win. So these are questions I think that are very important as we're organizing, to keep in mind, kind of in the back of our heads, as we're deciding paths forward. Can we answer these questions in satisfying ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I read that, given current events, I immediately think of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Right? They act like they deserve to win. It's
Yes.
the crux of the spoiler argument that they make, right? The idea that a vote for a Green is a vote for a Republican. It's a malicious manipulation of reality, right? That isn't in any way fact. It's an intentional misrepresentation of fact, but it's based on the fact that they believe that they deserve the vote of anyone who's not a Republican. Right, and that's they really do think they own these votes, right?
Yes.
So then you get to the front part of, with that in mind, you get to the front part of it. Says if we're not ready to govern, we're not ready to win. And Roe is a perfect example, right? 50 years of not governing, 50 years of the Republicans loudly telegraphing that this is their goal, and they never led. They never governed and pushed against it. I was having a conversation with a friend in the Green Party, and the question came up: what would a Green congressperson be doing right now? Right? Because the Democrats literally sung "God Bless the USA" and then went on vacation after Roe. They sang a song
Yep.
that still uplifted our country as this, though this isn't exactly who we are, right? They're still stuck in the this isn't who we are, despite it being clearly who we are as a society.
Don't
They
forget,
sung a kumbaya song, right? And then they went on vacation. And the best, the left flank of their party in AOC is like putting out tweets about what they could do, but she's not really taking any action. And so one of the things that we, when we were talking about it, that we said we thought Greens would be doing, if there was a Green congressperson right now, is that we thought that a Green would be in the House chambers demanding and trying to force a vote on the Women's Health Protection Act. The Democrats don't want to force that vote, just like they didn't want to force the vote on Medicare for all, right, during that movement, because it would publicly say that as Democrats, they don't support, as a party, that policy. And that's why they don't want to force a vote on the Women's Health Protection Act, because they can't pass it through the Senate. The anti-choice Democrats won't vote for it. So they won't actually govern on the issue. So yeah, when I read that quote, it seemed very apt for describing the Democratic Party right now, or the Democratic Party over the last 15 years.
Yeah, it works for the Democrats that they feel like they are entitled to do this, even though they're not really ready to govern. They're showing with their majorities that they are not ready to govern, that they had no plan on governing, or certainly not governing in a way consistent with what they promised, right? As for what it means for us, we have to be ready to govern before we're really ready to win. And I think it also kind of works the opposite way, right? That if we show that we're ready, people are gladly willing to vote for you. They see that you're prepared. They see that you mean what you say, and you win those votes. So I think it's a little bit of both ways here. We win by being prepared, and by being prepared, we're going to win. So these are important questions. We've gotten past kind of the first few phases of our model here. So to kind of finish up talking about our model, to do that big recruitment phase and to really understand where people are at, and to bring in people for support, to bring in new organizers and all, we have to engage in, we have to engage the community in many different ways, but one of the best ways is so-called deep canvassing. Our Green presidential nominee in 2020, Howie Hawkins, is, a long time expert in this. And he sums it up as do more listening than preaching. And I like the way he put that. Deep canvassing is about having conversations with people in your community, but specifically to listen to what they think are the problems and what they think might be solutions, and have that conversation around the issues that they're worried about. And that's how you build the trust and the good relationships over time, when you actually listen to them. One of the biggest feedbacks you get from this that people say is, I've never had the Democrats or the Republicans knock on my door and ask how I feel. They never care how I feel, right? They never care what I think. They never care where I worry about. So, one of the biggest things you can do as a Green is to knock doors. That immediately changes people's minds, right? I've never had this happen before. This is very interesting. And as you build trust over time, you might build that support, and you'll build that organizational structure to start winning some your goals and build from there. So, a lot of times when Democrats talk about canvassing, they talk about this very brief, you knock on the door, hey, are you going to vote for the Democrats? Do you know Tuesday is the day to vote? And they'll only go door knock on, like Chris was saying, the people in their electronic system that are marked as, strong supporters of Democrats, right? They get their list of registered Democrat voters. They look at the ones that are the strongest supporters. They go knock those doors and remind them to vote. It's very much a mobilizing mindset, and it's not going to do the organizing that we need to change people's minds and to build a movement. And there's research that even shows that brief door-to-door, if you just knock and remind people and all, has pretty much zero effect on people's voting choices. If you just say, hi, the election's Tuesday, here's my flyer or whatever, most people don't pay attention to that. Deep canvassing is very different, where you have this long conversation about their interests. Again, you're not there to preach. You're not there to say, here's what I want to do. You're there to say, I'm concerned about things and I want to hear your stance. I want to hear what you're worried about. I want to hear, how we can work together on this. And research has shown that does actually have measurable effects and does actually change people's minds. So I have linked here one study that said 10-minute conversations can actually reduce transphobia. A lot of times folks that, fall into very transphobic ideas and concepts and all are because they've been lied to. They've never met trans people, all these different things. So having that conversation and humanizing it and listening to their concerns and saying, oh no, here's what's going on, and building that trust and all is what eventually changes people's minds. And that's just one example. There, of course, there's lots of issues that research has shown that this is effective at. And it's much more effective than any other type of outreach, whether it's sending flyers, mailers, doing speeches, putting stuff on, YouTube and stuff and things. That doesn't mean that they have no effect. It just means that deep canvassing is one of the best things that you can do. That's going to most likely to change people's minds. So this is definitely a skill that you have to learn. And so it's probably best to work with others in your local Green Party to kind of learn the skills, to learn how to have these conversations. But anybody can do it. It's don't be afraid of it. In fact, a lot of folks, when they start doing deep canvassing, they report that that's actually some of the most fun that they have doing political organizing. When they go and talk to people and they have these really good deep conversations about issues, and they learn things about the community that they didn't know before, and they meet people in the community that are very interesting people that have their own histories and stories and all, and they have been itching to share that story with, but again, Republicans and Democrats never knock their doors. So you there listening, you learn more about the community, more about the issues, you build that trust, and they're ready to support you the next time that you decide to run for office or whatever it is, whatever your action is. So some tips on this is that it's got to be more than one encounter. It's got to be more than one 10-minute conversation. Ideally, you're repeatedly checking on people in your neighborhood very regularly. What that means is maybe a little bit up to you, but it has to be repeated contacts. And especially if it's for a campaign, if you're thinking of running for office, you've got to start way early. You don't knock someone's door a few weeks before election or whatever. It's, a year or two in advance, you've got to be talking to them and asking them what they're interested in, what they're worried about, and then check in with them repeatedly to ask, have their thoughts changed? Do they think things have gotten better, worse? And let them know more about your campaign slowly. That's how you build the trust and the support. Again, you want to listen to their concerns and try to relate those to your platform. So once you're running for office, you probably have decided some things that you want to highlight in your platform. But again, you don't want to show up and just preach your platform to people. When folks start talking about their concerns, you want to relate that to your platform. When they complain there's not enough good jobs or whatever it is, you want to relate that back. You're right, there's not enough good jobs. That's why I support a Green New Deal. That's going to build all kinds of green jobs around this area, and deal with pollution and all. You don't like the pollution, do you? There's ways that you can relate folks' concerns back to your platform. But of course, be open to adding things to your platform, or making it more clear, at least, as you're learning more from your community. It's better to not put voters on the spot and ask, do you support this, yes or no, or whatever. It's better to just ask more generally what their concerns are. And let them share what they're comfortable sharing with you. And as they trust you over time, they will share more. So another reason that you want to have more than one encounter. And over time, the way the conversations will evolve into support for your campaign, and eventually this person becoming a Green Party member, is first you listen and you learn more, and then you start taking action on those things, and you start giving small asks for them. The next time you go visit them, you say, hey, I know we've talked about this before. Can you sign my petition to city council or something like that, right? To support this issue. We've been talking about it a few months now. This is a petition about that, and they'll probably sign that. It's simple ask, takes 2 minutes for them to sign it. And if they do that, then the next time you go, you might ask them for some other petition. Say, hey, can I leave a petition with you? Can you ask a few of your friends? I know that you've got some other friends in the neighborhood. And then, they might say, yeah, I could do that. I could ask a few of my buddies at the bar to sign this. And you start moving them up the so-called ladders of engagement. You ask them to do more and more, then you get them more and more involved in your campaign and the Green Party. And before you know it, they're a full Green Party member, and not just a member. They have become an organizer, right? They have learned with you how to do petitioning and canvassing and all this stuff as you go. So, this is the great way to recruit and build your organizing effort over time. This is a over time method, but a very important one.
Yeah, and just to kind of real quick address each of those last three, this can be very formal, right? Where you get together and you go out, right? We're going to canvass as a team, and we're going to go through this neighborhood, and we're going to have these conversations, right? It can be planned, it can be a formal thing. It can also be very informal, right? Because you need multiple interactions. An example from today, when I was coming back from unsuccessfully trying to vote, I walked up to my house, and at the corner there were kids waiting for a school bus, and leaning against my fence by my gate was one of their fathers, making sure they got on, they safely made it on the school bus. And somebody I've seen in the neighborhood, we've nodded, we've said hi, but we didn't know each other. And I walked by and I was like, hey, just so I don't freak you out, I'm about to go right behind you through that gate. And it led to a 15-minute conversation, right? Where some of it was talking about our houses in our historic neighborhood and the renovations we've had to do to our 100-plus-year-old houses. And, but it's part of building that relationship over time. So, some of this can be very planned out, right? And it should be. You should be planning and reserving time when you're actually doing this. But at the same time, when you're at the local farmers market, right, and you just happen to run into someone that you've had previous conversations, that's a new touch, right? That's a new way to have that conversation. So it's like a 24/7, 365 type of organizing, where you've got, you meet your neighbors. We had someone on our last Organizing 101 call say, basically, how do I figure out where in my town to start organizing? And my response was your neighbor, and then your other neighbor, and then their neighbor, and then the other side's their neighbor, right? Obviously, we can do some targeting. We can choose our where we're focusing our time. But when it comes to this kind of deep canvassing, first and foremost, working class communities don't need people on white horses to save them, right? Which is what the top down, advocacy groups tend to do. They want to come in and they're going to save you. They don't need any more saviors on white horses coming in. You need to be feet on the ground, meeting them where they're at, right? And then the other side of it is that, sorry. The other side of it is that we, so we want to, I lost myself.
That's okay.
That cough through me. But yeah, these don't have to be rigid things, right? They can be much more fluid. That kind of leads into jump over the second to the last one, right? That guy that I have had that conversation today, just based off that one conversation, is now far more likely to be receptive, not only about signing a petition, but like, hey, we're having a rally about housing issues in town. And so each one of these touches gets you a little more of that real relationship that you need. And then, just going back to do more listening than preaching the power, right? It can't be underestimated how important that is, right? When we're doing deep canvassing, our job as socialist organizers is to be masters of making connections, masters of intersectionality, right? Masters of hearing their specific micro level issue and connecting it to the problems in our city, the problems in our state, the problems in our country, the problems in our world, and not the people who are doing them, but the systems that are perpetuating them, right? So, my consummate example for that is when we knocked doors, a lot of people in my town talked about the roads, and the quality of our infrastructure as one of their primary concerns. As an organizer, I know, because I've looked at city budgets, why we don't have the money, right? So when someone starts talking about how bad our roads are, I can say, well, did you know that most years our public works department and our police department put in the same budget request? The police department gets 99% of the money they ask for, and public works gets 30%. We have shitty roads because we're overfunding police, because we're overfunding authoritarian policing policies. Because we're spending $250,000 on a shot spotter system that can't tell the difference between a firework and a gunshot, which is true story in my town, something we're spending money on. In my neighborhood, we have 2 months of fireworks in my working class neighborhood around New Year's, around 4th of July, right? As soon as the fireworks stands pop up, people start buying them, and every single night, dozens of fireworks are going off illegally through my neighborhood. Our shot spotter system thinks every one of those is a gunshot, right? But that's what we're spending $250,000 on. And $250,000, say homelessness is one of your key issues. $250,000 is 5 times more per year than what my city spends to keep the overflow shelter open, right? So our job as organizers is to have a good intersectional systemic analysis that we're able to connect in. And this goes back to collective education, right? Where we're actually talking about as a group and learning about these things. So, it's really important that you listen and have these conversations. And sometimes things that you think are going to turn people off will fire them up, right? I've definitely had moments with community members when I was organizing where I thought, well, shit, they're gone. And the next day they showed back up, right? The organization I worked for, my executive director, who was based in Chicago, told me a story about an 80-something-year-old woman who they took a list of all of the abandoned properties in the neighborhood that were owned by a specific bank to that bank. And they said, we want to talk to you about, the abandonment issues that you are causing in our neighborhood. They were all arrested. And my executive director thought, I lost one, right? She came to the first thing she ever came to, and she ended up in jail. She got out of jail and said, when are we going back? Right? And I had the same experience with I took an older gentleman to meet the mayor, and he asked a question the mayor didn't like, and we got removed from the mayor's office. And we're walking out, and he said, we're coming back next week for the next one. I'll see you then, right? So when you start building these relationships, you'd be amazed at once the trust is built, the level that people will dive full in, because no one's ever shown up for them before. No one's ever, tried to empower them, right? That's what we're doing as organizers. We're not trying to solve people's problems. We're trying to empower them and their communities so that they can solve them themselves in ways that make sense for them. Because my solution to a neighborhood, my solution to Pillsbury, where I don't live, I live a mile away from it, might be way different from the people who live there, right? They may not want a solar panel plant. They may want a park, and that's an important thing to have. So, it's that our job is, we've really got to understand what our job is as organizers and how it's fundamentally different from how mainstream political operatives operate, and act.
Yep, for sure. So I just want to do a time check here. It's been a couple hours. Do we have any questions in the chat? And then we
had one about is organizing around multiple issues prescribed? It seems it's easier to get more numbers by building a broad multi-issue movement. I would respond, and that was from Michael Shin on Zoom. But I would respond to that by saying it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Right? Because absolutely, if you really focus it now, there's benefits to really focusing, right? You can put all your resources towards it. You're not cannibalizing your own, resources. You're not diverting things that you need and attention that you may need. So it allows you to really intensely organize. But as Michael kind of, implied in this question, it also limits you to people who are only interested in that. So I think that's, where listening to what people are interested in really comes in, to being able to really key into what's important, right? Because that's one thing that's often misrepresented in polling. People, when people get polled on an issue, they get asked whether they support it or not. But they don't generally publicize, even if they do get asked, is how important is it, right? And how important is it is a really big part of whether or not someone will jump in, right? Loosely supporting Medicare for all, because philosophically it sounds like a good idea, or it makes fiscal sense, right? 50% of registered Republicans support Medicare for all, and I bet a lot of them it's a fiscal thing, and a lot of them it's an access thing, but just kind of loosely supporting it for those types of reasons is different than I've been uninsured for years or underinsured. I can't go to the doctor, right? That person's been they have a vested material interest in it, and they're going to go, right? So I would generally advocate for multi-issue organizations and movements, especially we're a Green Party, right? We are by definition a very broad issue organization. So that it's kind of built into what we do. But at the same time, if you've got 10 people and they're each working on 10 things independently, your success rate is going to be way lower than if you had those 10 people working on 2 things in groups of 5. And that's the kind of internal, democracy that you need to have. And you need to be able to work things out, and you need to be able to kind of analyze, where are we working? Where are we at in the process of different things, right? Because having 4 campaigns that are all kind of in the same level of activity and at the same level of development and evolution is a big resource sink. But if you've got one that's at stage 4 and one that's at stage 3 and 2 and 1, and they're staggered like that, then it's a whole lot more manageable, right? That one that's in initial stages is all about research that can be done at any time, policy analysis, that kind of stuff, and you're not worrying about thinking about like a local action or something like that. If you have 4 issues you're trying to pass through your city council, you don't want them all up at once, because you're going to waste your political capital, right? You can only go and demand votes from someone who might not necessarily support you so many times, right? So how many issues you're working on is a balancing act, and where the tipping point is largely depends on the capacity of the organization, right? And so another area you might want to think about is in terms of this. Let's say in the beginning you had an organizing area that you thought was going to be really successful, but it's just not bringing new organizers and new activists into your organization. You may want to put that one on the back burner, right? Because if it's not building your organization, it's going to be harder for you to increase your capacity. You're putting resources into something that's not having a measurable return. So yeah, it's a really hard balancing act. I think it's really important to be fluid. And that, I think, is going to be where a lot of the multi-issue stuff comes out, right? You're focused on a campaign really hard for this, but then something happens in the world and you get pulled in. And there's a pros and cons cost analysis thing you got to do to say, do we really get pulled in, or do we keep doing our thing? But I think a lot of the time you're going to get pulled into other things by stuff outside your control, right? Did anyone think we were going to be talking about this much about public health in 2019? when we were getting ready for a presidential election, but then public health became a absolutely key part of political conversations in the 2020 election, right? So we've got to be able to do that balancing act, and we've got to be able to shift and be fluid, because the world's shifting and fluid. So
Yeah.
It all depends on your material, what's going on in your local, right? What can you handle, what can't you, and figuring out that balance for you. Because I'll tell you, as someone who's been, a decade at organizing on the national level, 9 years in the National Green Party, burnout's a real problem, right? So you don't want to overload yourself, and it's so easy to do because there's so many important issues. But you're not useless to anyone if you burn out, right? You're not used. I had a friend in Occupy that literally didn't know how to respond to something and ripped his shirt off and stormed out of the meeting and never came back. Right? He was burnt out. He just didn't have the emotional energy to deal with something, and he flipped and we lost a person. So it's like balancing a scale during an earthquake. But in general, yes, I am a big fan of multi-issue, and this is where collaboration also comes in, right? You don't have to do it yourself. Find partners. You want to work on tenancy stuff, find your local tenant union. You want to work on environmental stuff, talk to your local environmental groups, right? Don't fight over turf. Come in and say, how do we collaborate? How do we use our power to amplify each other? And that will really open the doors to doing a lot more and speaking on a lot more issues without actually taking on all of the load yourself, in terms of the work.
Yeah, we've had to just kind of give a quick example of that in my local Pittsburgh Green Party. We've run into that where we've actually been growing in the past few years. We've had new members come in, and the different members, of course, come from different backgrounds, and so they tend to have different interests. So they proposed to create different working groups to focus on different things. So there's, for example, an anti-fracking working group, because fracking and petrochemicals are a big thing in Western Pennsylvania. They want the next Cancer Alley petrochemical hub that's currently in Louisiana. They want to make another one in Pennsylvania, away from the hurricanes, right? Because they know that climate change is a problem. So, we're organizing against that. But we also have a racial justice work group. We also have, a voting issues work group. We have several different work groups. And the conversation started to become, hey, let's work on this thing. Oh, I can't because I'm going to the working group meeting. Okay, well, can we do another working group on Thursday? Oh, and then someone else would come in and say, oh, the Supreme Court just ruled we need a feminist working group to work on abortion rights, and it kind of exploded very rapidly in the past year to where instead of having like 2 working groups, we had like 10 working groups, and it was too much. It was burning people out because everyone was involved in like 5 different groups. And it was just too much to do for, still our size of group. But we have allies. Our local DSA is okay. We've worked with them before. We work with the local Sunrise chapter. We work with the local Socialist Alternative chapter, on different things, different types of events, but that's kind of the point. So we've been able to say, well, you know what? DSA has a really good feminist organizing work group already. So instead of us hosting our own, let's ask Greens to join that. And we'll have one of our folks be the liaison between the Green Party and them, and we can work on it together. With Socialist Alternative and others, we plan anti-war actions and what would you call it? Like pro-Palestine BDS actions, right? We do that together with them. We don't have our own working group. We do that together with them so that we're not, burning ourselves out trying to run everything on our own. We're collaborating with others. So, the Green Party is a very much a multi-issue movement. It's very much in our platform and our key values and everything, right? The whole point of eco-socialism, go back and look at our eco-socialism 101 and our Green Party 101. The underlying philosophy is recognizing how interconnected human society and nature are, and how all of these issues are really deeply interconnected with each other. You can't separate them. Of course, we're concerned about all of these issues, but it's also a capacity issue, making sure we're not burning ourselves out, making sure we're focusing on, things that we can take action on today, and collaborating with others to make sure that we're getting, between all of our organizations, we're forming a mass movement for all of these issues, and we're not just taking it all on ourselves. Which is honestly part of democracy, right? It's making sure that everyone is empowered to take actions and not just a small group that represents everyone else. No, we want everyone to be involved. So I agree with what Chris said, and that's kind of our real world example that we can aspire to many different issues, but we should, depending on the level of members you have, keep it sustainable, keep it manageable, make sure folks don't burn out. And as you build capacity, as you build membership, you can take on more projects. As you build more alliances with other groups, you can take on more projects. That's what you want to focus on. All right. So any other questions or how are you feeling, Chris?
I'd say let's burn through the rest.
Burn through the rest. Yeah. All right. So we mentioned in recruiting here at the very bottom, right? As you're deep canvassing, you make small asks of folks and you move them up the ladders of engagement. So real quick, we'll talk about ladders of engagement. It's the idea of having a series of steps where you start from very small, very easy asks so that somebody can very quickly take action and feel good about it. And as they show interest and as they take those actions and they build confidence and they learn more, you pull them into bigger and bigger organizing steps. And eventually they reach a point where they have been so engaged and learned so much that they themselves are now organizers. And ultimately, that is our goal here as organizers, I feel like, at least. And many of those sources that we've mentioned feel like organizing is partly it's partly almost like a pyramid scheme kind of thing, right? Like I organize to make other organizers, and then they go out and they make other organizers. And that's ultimately how we build a mass movement, except instead of under capitalism being an actual pyramid scheme and all for organizing, it's actually what works. It's actually what builds a movement. So the ladders of engagement are kind of a way of measuring that, of measuring how engaged someone is. And over time, slowly pulling them up to be their own organizer, where they can go off and start training their own organizers underneath them. And that's how we build our big movement.
When I was a community organizer, one of the things we talked about when we were organizing in neighborhoods was that we were trying to organize our way out of a job. Yeah. Right? My goal when I started organizing in the neighborhood was that neighborhood developed its own leadership, that neighborhood developed its own strategies, that neighborhood developed its own, common, goals and things like that, and that I got to move to the next neighborhood over, right? That I no longer needed to call a meeting every month or every week, that I no longer needed to send out, volunteers to knock on doors, that they were taking care of that themselves, and that I could move on, right? And so that's kind of our goal as organizers, is to, especially like we said, as overextended, overworked organizers, is to develop people to a point that they can take things off our plate, that we can move to other things, that we can work with other people, and they can then autonomously do the work that we were before kind of babysitting and micromanaging and teaching our way through, and then move from there.
Yeah. So, a typical ladder, particularly for digital engagement, as like on the image on the right here, where you start at the bottom. At first, you're just asking people to read, right? And to learn. And if they read and they learn and they like it, then you ask them to share. And if they share it with their friends, some people will never share it. And if they never share it, then they're probably not interested in being an organizer, right? So don't spend your energy on that, right? Spend the energy on the people that are interested in sharing and are interested in moving up to the next level, finding out how to volunteer more. So look at the people who shared and reach out to them and say, hey, would you like to come to our meeting on Tuesday? Would you like to come to our action on Friday? We have a Green Party social event on Sunday. Would you get them involved somehow. You ask them to come volunteer. And then that's a small ask. You say, hey, just come to our meeting for an hour. Just come to, there's going to be a rally at the city building. The city council building or whatever, just for an hour on Friday. Can you do that? The people that start showing up to those events, now you know that those are people that are really interested in being involved. So you can start asking them to do more. Instead of showing up for an hour, like, hey, can you help organize an event on Friday? Can you bring the signs, right? Like, we'll do all this stuff. Can you bring
host a sign making party?
Right, exactly. Can you host a sign making party and bring the signs for the event? You start to get them more and more engaged and have more and more responsibility within the movement as they go up the ladder. And eventually, like I said, they reach to the point where they are now leaders of the movement. They are leaders of the Green Party. They are organizers themselves who now know what to do. And they can branch off and say, this is where we were saying earlier for the Green Party Pittsburgh, for example, they have the skills to say, I'm going to go form a working group on the things that I want. And they know how to do the same ladder model for the thing that they're doing. Let's start a new working group. We've built up more members. We're ready. We're going to start a new working group on this thing. And they could start the ladders over again. Start educating people on issues. Start making people share. Start making people show up to events. You do the same thing over again until you keep building your capacity. Now, this is digital engagement, but of course, it can be in-person engagement too. It's same sort of thing, right? Do you show up to a meeting? Do you show up to an action? Do you show up to a planning meeting? All these things. You pull people up.
And don't be worried when some people fall off, right?
Yeah.
Every rung, you're going to have people where that rung is their threshold, and that's okay, right? Maybe that's where they always stay, and that's okay. And maybe it takes time and relationships and things that happen in their lives to advance them. Some people will leapfrog steps, right? Looking at the ladder, this from Salsa Labs, which is a digital, focused thing, but it's a really good picture of the ladder, right? Which is why we used it. But there's people who will share your stuff every day and who will donate online, but will never come in person. And it could be a comfort thing. It could be an ability thing, right? It could be a scheduling and resource thing. So it's not even necessarily that, obviously it'd be great if every person became an organizer. But not becoming an organizer doesn't mean that someone is less valuable necessarily to the organization, right? They can fill different roles at different levels. And those roles and levels, those roles can adjust over time. Yeah.
Somebody that doesn't come to meetings but is otherwise very engaged could be your social media director. It's there's not really one ladder. There's multiple ladders, multiple paths, and it's allocating people to, calling back to like our first slide, I think it was, pulling people toward important tasks in our movement that also fit their interest and skills. All right. So there's more about recruiting methods that we pulled from Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry, which is a book by William Z. Foster back during the big union movements in the early 1900s. This was a really important manual that was used by a lot of unions at the time. And interestingly, in modern efforts, the Amazon unions were apparently inspired in part by this reading. So it's an interesting short book on how to organize. Again, it's organizing in a workplace, which is a little bit different from community organizing, but we could still take a lot from it. So there's individual recruitment, for example, where you might target individual people and ask them to join the Green Party, or join an action. Not that do your ladder thing. But you focus on one person, and then, like we were saying, ask that person to invite their friends and neighbors, and you end up pulling in a lot of people that way over time, especially if the people that you're targeting are in allied organizations or people that you know are already interested in the issues that you're working on. So you can really build up a movement pretty quickly that way of folks who are interested in the issue and, that already have some level of trust with each other.
Yeah, the easiest campaign that I know of to grow your organization is a build a friend campaign or bring a friend campaign, right?
Yep.
If everyone brings one person, we doubled our size.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a low bar ask. But it's something that, the Illinois Green Party has had multiple membership drives where the core thing that we pushed was for our existing members to bring one new person into the organization.
Yep. Yeah, so that's one tactic. There's also an open recruitment tactic, which is maybe a little bit less successful, but it depends on the situation. You can have kind of public events or public meetings and kind of advertise widely. And when new folks come in, you're prepared right there. You say, are you not a member yet? Okay, here's the information on how to become a member. Here's the information on how to get involved. And that can take different forms. It could be that you have a special onboarding session before the meeting even takes place, or it could be that maybe during a more, kind of hate to use the term, but a more boring aspect of the business meeting, right? Not everyone loves Robert's rules and all, right? Maybe have interesting speakers or something at first, and then when you get to the business meeting, you pull the new members aside and say, "Hey, let me catch you up on the organization. Here's how things work. Here's our organizational structure. Here's how you can become a member. Are you ready to become a member today?" I think pretty much anytime you hold any sort of big event or meeting or something, you should be at least prepared to do this, even if that's not necessarily your goal with every meeting. And I know it works because we've had in Pennsylvania, the Green Party of Pennsylvania has had its statewide, delegates meeting of the people that, make up the state committee, the decision makers of the Green Party of Pennsylvania. We've had that statewide meeting in Pittsburgh, for example, and we've advertised it to the public, and we've had new people come to those meetings to find out what is the Green Party about. And some of those people have joined and are still members today after coming, years ago. So, this can work. It's a thing to keep in mind, at least. And kind of related to that is mass agitation. In order to get people to know about your meeting, to go to it, and to be recruited, they have to know about you. So you want to put slogans out there to popularize demands of your movement, to get your name out there in the name of your organization. Use various printed materials, flyers and pamphlets and whatnot. There's radio, there's TV, maybe even community broadcast TV at this point. But a lot of it's online now, YouTubes and podcasts, things like that. Try to get on podcast as a guest or whatever and get your message out there. And you can purposely have these big mass meetings that get a lot of attention. And I like this quote that one good mass meeting is better than a dozen indifferent ones. I think a lot of folks feel like you're supposed to have a monthly meeting or whatever, right? Like that's just how organizations work. You have a monthly meeting, and you should never feel like you have to go through the motion like that, right? It's way better, instead of meeting weekly or monthly or like that, if you have like quarterly meetings, but they are awesome meetings where you run like an education session, and there's guest speakers, and there's like a workshop where people learn things and all. Doing that correctly is way better than having a bunch of boring meetings. So you might want to put all your effort in having really cool mass meetings where people can learn stuff and be involved in workshops and whatnot, which is related to the educational programming, the last bullet there.
These are all we've touched on it a lot, in a lot of these slides, but it's, I want to explicitly repeat again, you want as many access points as possible, right? So what I often tell Greens looking to start a local, for the minimum, right, that they should be doing is, you have your monthly business meeting, right? To is the the boring side of things, right? But it shouldn't be, right? It should be
Shouldn't
the
be.
strategic side of things. But that's not for everybody, right? So you should always have your business meeting. You should always have a social event of some kind. And then you should always have an educational event. And then, if possible, try to have an action, a rally, a protest of some kind of thing where it's oriented more towards that kind of action. The actions that we talk about in movements. And if you do that, you've got such a multiplicity of ways that people can get involved, right? The activist that loves to have the sign and chant gets to go to your action. The people who are interested in learning about a subject can go to the education one. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of social things to build the relationships internally, right, within your organization. And I've got to say, in my experience, some of the best ideas come in these unstructured social times. Where you can have that conversation of, hey, what about? That frankly, hey, what about isn't usually meant for a membership meeting. It's not ready, right? If it's just a nebulous idea, you're going to spend hours talking in circles and likely come away with no real, with no real action items, right? But when you're all hanging out at the local park, when you're all hanging out at a local eatery, right? A lot of green parties that I know have done social events in bars, right? That's much more of a place where these ideas that are outside the box can come out, and then they can get fleshed out later, right? I will say one thing: I highly recommend not using a bar. It excludes a lot of people who don't drink or don't like bar culture. Bars generally aren't the best places for conversations, and again, in my experience, the combination of alcohol, politics, and strangers is not necessarily the best environment.
Yeah.
That said, if you've got the right location, it might work for you on the local level. But having that multiple access points is absolutely key. The Green Party has probably lost thousands and thousands and thousands of activists because they showed up to a boring business meeting. No one told them how to really get involved. No one, got them onboarded, and they never came back again. Right? So we've got to make sure that we're providing ways that people can get involved that are of interest to them. The person that, and some people will come to all four. Garrett and I will be at all four meetings, right? And some people will come to all four meetings, and some people will only come to some, right? But it's the access point that gets them involved, and then you can start on the ladders of engagement and all the other kind of methods that we've talked about.
Yep. Yeah, so there's some recruitment methods, and just to kind of expand real fast on the recruiting methods and getting your name out there. Use all the platforms you can to get your name out there, but don't over rely on social media. That a lot of this is personal connections, like we've been saying. It's that the deep canvassing, making connections in your community, and your connections have connections, and it pulls in people kind of organically. You win when you have name recognition, basically. This is advice from the campaign manual for Bernie Sanders' campaign, actually, and that 89% of people have to recognize your name before you can really have a winning campaign. So you've got to make sure that your name is out there. Most folks, especially today, highly distrust government. We already kind of talked about that. So you want to make sure that you build trust and you make a good impression with them. And that includes making sure that your candidates are bright, energetic, fair-minded. That's kind of what voters are looking for. That they're listening, and that they're ready to take action. That they're not the boring, stuffy politicians in suits that they're used to, right? aside from making contact with people in your community, you also probably want to make personal contact with the local journalists in your community. Find out what newspapers or newsletters exist in your community, and talk to those reporters, talk to those journalists. Write letters to
the
them.
tech staffers, right? In a lot of smaller markets like mine,
Yeah.
When we send out a press release, when Chelsea Manning was released from prison, we had a celebratory rally at our old state capitol where Lincoln served, and we sent out our press releases and everything. And the journalist that showed up was the cameraman for the local TV station. There was no reporter. The cameraman was very much on our side, and he, asked us questions, did the interview, and I got to talk about imperialism on the news. Right? That might not have gotten past a reporter, but it got through to the working class cameraman. That same cameraman, at another rally, we were having a minimum wage rally. This was in 2012 or 2011. We were having a minimum wage rally, and chance happened that it was 105 the day of the rally. As I'm sure you can guess what that did to attendance, right? So we had a relatively small rally, and the cameraman helped us. He showed us where he was going to put his camera, how we should stand, and it took a few dozen people and made us look like hundreds. Right? And it's because if minimum wage went up, he got a raise, because that's where he was. My local newspaper almost never sent a reporter. They send a photographer, and then the reporter calls you later, right? So a lot of times it's knowing the support people, and they're often way more working class and way more connected with our issues. So it's not just those journalists and editors, right? They're the ones with the control, but it's like everything. Connecting with the people that do the actual work, the grunt work, can have huge dividends. I've had more dividends from being good with cameramen than I ever had from being good with a journalist. So.
Well, there you go. So, but yeah, make connections with the news, more or less, right?
Yeah.
That could get you attention. Make sure that you have, attractive literature and signs that catch the eye and people notice it, but also it has to relate to their genuine issues. It has to relate to the things that they care about locally. So make sure you have a good message there. And lastly, those door-to-door conversations are important. Like we said, keep up the deep canvassing.
And make sure you're hitting bread and butter issues, like kitchen table issues. I have my state house rep is a Democrat who's actually a Republican. To the point that she opposed marijuana legalization and decriminalization. She opposed civil unions. She opposed gay marriage. She supported gay conversion therapy. And this is a supposed Democrat. But when I just got a mailer from her ahead of the primaries. Nothing about economics, nothing about the environment, nothing about healthcare. And I can tell you from doing surveys for years, these are key issues. Nothing about infrastructure, right? Her number one issue on her literature that she's, paid money to mail to my house is that she wants to lower the age that kids can be alone at home. Right? And so you get it and you read that and you just show that you are completely disconnected from the lives of real people. So you want to make sure that you're choosing your issues wisely, making those local connections wisely. And I will say, as Greens, and this is a criticism of Green philosophy that has been in the past, and we need to focus a lot more on quality than quantity. It's easy to get wrapped up into someone needs to run, and to run an unserious, unsuccessful campaign. We're far, just like that thing about meetings, right? One good meeting is better than a dozen ineffectual meetings, and the same goes for candidates. One good candidate can grow your party far more than 12 unserious candidates.
For sure. Yeah, so we've been mentioning candidates, and so this slide kind of sums that up, I guess, that a lot of folks see community organizing and elections as kind of, if not mutually exclusive, at least kind of at odds with each other a little bit, right? Some folk will say, why are you wasting your time doing all that? You gotta work on a campaign. And then others will say, why do you waste your time voting, right? Go organize. And it's not an either or. That's what we want to kind of point out here, that it's not an either or debate. It's two tactics of part of a larger strategy, essentially. We have to be in both spaces. We have to be organizing, mutual aid efforts and, community actions in general, as well as being involved in the electoral arena, because that's just where a lot of power and decision making happens today. So we have to be involved in both, but that also means we have to be careful with how we put the two together to make sure that they're, for lack of a better term, synergizing, right? And that they're not working against each other, because that is a real risk. You want to make sure that they're not working against each other, but instead reinforcing each other and building on each other. And so one example, the kind of middle bullets there, electoral campaigns have a finite lifespan. The folks that are running for Congress, they're running for Congress right now, or state house right now. But that campaign is up in November, right? So campaigns have definite beginnings and endings, but our organizing work never really ends. We are always organizing, always adapting. Until capitalism is gone, we're going to keep organizing, and even at that point, we're probably going to keep organizing because, we'll probably never have a perfect society, so to speak, right? There will always be challenges and issues. We talked about this in our Eco-Socialism 101. We'll always want to try to make things better. So organizing is this, ongoing process, whereas electoral campaigns are very short-lived. And what happens a lot with those gaps is people will come into the electoral campaign, the campaign's over, and then they disappear because they don't have anything, or they don't know what else to do, right? So they just fall out. And we criticized the Bernie campaign earlier, right, for that happening, that folks were generally, once the campaign was over, they were just kind of left adrift without any sort of idea of what else to do, with the sole exception of well, go vote Democrat, go vote, or go support Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, which a lot of folks didn't want to do. And so given no other option, there was nothing else to do. The Bernie campaign fell apart instead of becoming a long-term organizing effort, which is really a shame, because it could have become a larger working class movement. But that's why we keep at this, right? But we want to make sure that we're not making the same mistake with our green campaigns. We have to make sure that our green campaigns for office are feeding into actions that happen between and during campaigns, to keep people energized and to keep people focused on what we're building for the future. The campaigns should help emphasize those actions and funnel people into it. And then, as our actions build momentum and all, then those actions should spin off like, okay, we've built enough of a base around this issue that it's time to run a candidate for city council or whatever to make it happen. So, you want to have the two that balance each other and use each other strategically to build the overall mass organization.
Yeah, the first green congressperson, in my opinion, is not going to come based on the charisma of the candidate. It's going to happen based on the organization of the party in the supporting area. Right? And I've been asked a lot, who is going to be the first green congressperson? Right. My answer to that question is actually, where are we going to produce our first green congressperson, right? That's a different, it's a different focus and a different understanding of how to build power and how to win. 80 to 90% need to know your name, right? But if you don't have a committed team that's able to go out and canvas for you, that's able to show up and produce for you, that's able to fill key roles on your campaign team, it doesn't matter how charismatic you are, you're probably going to fall short. And there's obviously outliers there, but Congress isn't generally a thing you can luck into, though, right?
No.
Just use my personal example here in Illinois. Just to get on the ballot for Congress, I'm going to have to collect probably it changes year to year based on the vote, but over 15,000 signatures in 90 days. Charisma cannot collect 15,000 signatures in 90 days. That takes organization.
Right.
And we've got to be able to move that. The key here is that transition from campaign into organization and organization into campaign. And that helps us. That also means you're not starting from scratch, right? As your activists move cycle to cycle, the person that picked up social media because someone needed to pick it up gains a lot of skill, gains a lot of experience, and 2 cycles from now, maybe your rock star social media person. They just needed time to develop. And because they went from being the campaign was like, hey, that was better social media than we were doing as a state party. So you go to that person and you say, would you like to help us with our state party social media? And then they spend 2 years doing it with the party, and then they're ready to do it at a higher level the next time they cycle into a campaign. So that back and forth transition is essential for developing our base, developing our bench, and sustaining ourselves long term.
Yep, exactly. I had some tips last minute here for organizing as an introvert. I think it came up as maybe a question the last time. I don't remember exactly why I added this. But I thought it was important to point out because a lot of the stuff we've talked about so far, knocking doors and things like that, it's very extrovert seeming activities, right? You got to be very comfortable going and talking to people. And one aspect of that is, as fairly introverted person myself, is that it's not as bad as it sounds. That actually, if you go and do it, you'll probably enjoy it more than you expect. That said,
especially if you're doing deep canvassing and having actual conversations.
Yeah,
right?
if you're having
it's
actual
very uncomfortable to do mainstream canvassing, to do Democrat or Republican canvassing, because you go to a door, you knock, and you tell them what to think.
right,
and it's not a good way to start a relationship. But if you're doing the deep canvassing, it's also called relational organizing, right? If you're doing it that way, these become organic conversations. I remember once when I was a field director for a community org, I got a call and one of my organizers one of my canvassers was missing. No one could find her. And so we started freaking out. She wasn't answering her phone. Someone was feeding her lunch. She knocked on the door and ended up getting a lunch, right? And she's a very introverted. She was one of our more introverted canvassers, right? But because it was a different kind of conversation, because we weren't there to say, vote for this person because they'll do X, Y, and Z. We were there to have a conversation about how they felt in their community. She was able to, get to the point that she was sitting at a table ignoring her boss and her husband's calls.
Yeah, exactly. So that's half of the advice, right? That give the true deep canvassing a shot because you might enjoy it more than you think. But the other half is that even if you do sort of enjoy that and you're still just generally not comfortable with big large events and around lots of people and it burns you out, it's very energy draining and all, there's still ways to be involved, right? There's ways to hold meetings online and to get involved online. Lots of writing tasks, for example. There's graphic design, there's social media, there's all these things that could be done.
Research, policy writing.
Yeah, research, policy writing, exactly. There's all these ways that you can be involved without necessarily being the person that goes door to door or giving the big speech or whatever it is. And another piece of advice, which I think goes in with sort of the deep canvassing, is that when you do have these in-person meetings, part of the introvert and I guess generally like neurodivergent sort of thing is that we have a really hard time like with small talk, right? And kind of blending in with that like normal sort of thinking. So to kind of avoid those awkward moments of small talk and stuff like that, have in-person meetings where there's some specific activity that can help kind of guide that socialness. So for example, having a neighborhood cleanup can be a lot of fun. Getting together and planting trees or a community garden or something could be fun. Making signs. Maybe you're not the person that wants to be at the rally or giving a speech at the rally or whatever, but you can go and make signs at a smaller party with, friends that you know in the Green Party or whatever. You can make signs for that rally. And having social events we talked about is really important to kind of boost morale. So, have something like a game night where you can get to know each other without that awkward what do we talk about? The weather, or the bar atmosphere, bar culture, like we were saying. So, I think these are all ways to kind of work around that and put your introvert skills to use in the campaign, right? Not everybody has to do every task, and that's perfectly okay. You should do what you're comfortable with, what you're happy with, what fits your skills, and all that stuff. So there's ways for you to be involved. And on the flip side, as a note to organizers, make sure that you're making open spaces for people like that and that they have the channels to know how they can get involved in these sort of things. That it's easier for an introverted person to sign up to do social media, for example. There's got to be a way to do that. So, making democratic, inclusive spaces includes this kind of stuff. So just something to keep in mind. I think I promised this is like the last slide. I know we're really running out of time here. The last phase we talked about was forming kind of your full structure here. We had talked about doing the background research, doing the outreach, building your membership and all. So when you actually have a formal Green Party local or a formal campaign that has been structured or ready to be structured, what are the kind of things that you look at? The top tip that I want to point out quick, and this, there's more to it obviously, is to avoid the so-called tyranny of structurelessness, which is a really big thing that tends to come around green circles, because Greens have the values of we want to promote grassroots democracy, decentralization, and folks making decisions for themselves. And these are all really great values. But in order to implement them correctly, actually takes a lot of organization and a lot of cooperation and coordination. And that's kind of where a lot of folks fail. It's where the Green Party has historically not always done as well as it should have. So we want to try to avoid the tyranny of structurelessness. And this is a quote that I want to say is from Howie Hawkins, but I don't remember. An organization without common policies, without even the means to establish common policies and actions, is not decentralized, it's disorganized. There is a difference between decentralized and disorganized. We want to be decentralized, but that means we have to be very organized, with good communication, with good cooperation, with good decision-making structures, all of that stuff. If we don't have those things, then it just becomes a disorganized mess. So we want to try to avoid that. Some things to keep in mind in order to be more organized is to have a good set of bylaws that set a democratic decision-making process, whatever that is. It could be majority vote or a 2/3 vote or some form of consensus making, whatever fits for your group. You want to make sure you define who the members are, who you're accountable to, who the officers are, what their duties and responsibilities are, and how you elect them. It's probably going to be inevitable that at some point, some members will have some sort of disagreement or conflict, and it doesn't mean that either of them are bad people or whatever, but just, disputes happen, right? Conflict happens. And that's part of democracy, to learn how to deal with it. So make sure that you have some sort of dispute or conflict resolution plan in place before it happens, because otherwise it can be, it can derail a lot of efforts, right? If you're kind of trying to figure out how to handle it as you go. It's better to set that up front and set the expectation up front. And then lastly, most organizations need money to do things, and we want to avoid the traps of behaving like capitalists, but we do need money. So one common way of doing it is membership dues. So you want to set membership dues and all in your bylaws as well. There's also a lot of infrastructure that you need, particularly for doing digital outreach and engagement, like we said. A CRM where your contact list is, so that you can email people, you can text people, you can tag them based on the levels of engagement, the ladders of engagement we were talking about. So you know who to contact for what type of action or whatever. That's where CRM is really good. There's a lot of different ones that exist. You can use Nation Builder, Action Network, MailChimp to some degree can help you with this. There's a lot of options there. You need communication and project management stuff. Slack and Basecamp and whatnot are good things to do communications and project management, to manage documents and to-do lists and tasks and stuff like that. And lastly, you need digital engagement, which a lot of times is built into the CRM stuff, so that you can have online petitions and online surveys and all that people can fill out and forward to their friends and share on social media and all that stuff. There's obviously a lot that goes into this stuff. Chris has a really great systems workshop that he did at a previous Green Party annual national meeting. So there's YouTube videos for that. I'm sure that we'll probably revisit it as GSOP videos too at some point in future educational videos. But these are things at least to keep in mind. And, of course, feel free to reach out to your local Green Party or GSOP for, advice on these sort of things.
So one real quick, we had a question on YouTube. What do you do when a new member disagrees with a policy? And
what did you say? I didn't hear the question.
Oh, what do you do when you have a new member who disagrees with a policy and it's an important issue to them?
Yeah.
And I mainly want to bring it up because here's where we talked about conflict resolution. Here's where you talked about decision making. So I mean, I guess there's a few ways, kind of thresholds, I guess would be the best way to describe it. Right. There may be some things that are non-negotiable, with your organization. The Green Party of Florida just split ways with a candidate because they had fundamental disagreements over key issues like reparations. And the Green Party of Florida wasn't willing to bend. The Green Party of the United States disaffiliated the Green Party of Georgia because of positions on trans right, their anti-trans positions that they took. And the National Committee of the Green Party voted, and it was a supermajority vote to withdraw their affiliation, so that they are no longer a part of the Green Party of the United States. Because it was decided that was an issue, that was a position that we weren't going to compromise on. That said, platforms, especially national political party platforms, are massive, right? If you actually read through the Green Party platform, you'll find out in many ways it's contradictory, right? So it's not the end of the, so the first threshold is those core beliefs, right? Those core ideas that you're not willing to compromise, basic human rights, things like that. The next line is, things that you can agree to disagree with. And when you get past kind of those, democracy is involved in all of them, right? Deciding whether something's a non-negotiable. But this is where that democratic decision making comes in, right? Conflict is essential for change and for growth, right? So when these conflicts come up, we've got to, as an organization, be able to address them in a direct and respectful and positive manner, right? We've got to be able to not burn all the bridges because we disagree over 5% on an issue, right? And to do that, we've got to be able to have, comradely discourse. We've got to be able to have discussions that don't erupt into flameouts and bridges burning. We've got to have a culture in our organization that says when a democratic decision is made, I'm okay with it, even if I disagree, because it was democratic, right? I have numerous times in my time in the Green Party forced a vote because I knew I would lose because I wanted it on the record, right? And when I lost, I didn't bring it up every meeting and try to overrule it, right? I didn't leave the party. Now, there are certainly things that I may leave, that if a decision was made, it would be a non-negotiable for me, and I would, but for most things, I have always been perfectly happy to lose, right? But it can't be unilaterally decided. It's got to be done democratically. And then kind of to follow up on that is that conflict resolution plan, right? What happens when a candidate bucks part of the platform, right? What happens when a candidate, and candidate is just kind of an easy way to discuss it, but also a member, right? What happens when a member acts or says or speaks against, something that the party broadly believes, and how do you address it? How do you have those discussions? What kind of disciplinary actions are taken? What kind of, all of that kind of stuff. So it's absolutely essential to have, and it's got to be in place beforehand, right? Your democratic decision-making process has to be in place beforehand. Your conflict resolution process has to be in place beforehand. One example I'd use is that we had an event that we were expecting disruption at. And we were trying to stop the disruption from happening. But weeks before the event even happened, when our organization met for our monthly meeting, we had an in-depth discussion about the expected disruption. And we agreed before the fact, before the event, how we would respond if X, Y, or Z happened. So when the event happened and the disruption happened, there was no real big debate, right? There had been a democratic decision that was thought out and made beforehand, and it's smoothly was dealt with in terms of that event. So by having those things in place, you can deal with it way better. And I'll say the lack of conflict resolution, infrastructure and institutions and processes, the lack of, we like to throw around on the left the idea of restorative justice, but most organizations and most communities don't have a process, don't have an apparatus to actually deliver it. So when someone's, raises ire, you're trying to work out what restorative justice looks like with hostile parties, because it's fresh and it's raw and it's real, right? Whereas it's way smoother to deal with these things if you know, okay, this is what it takes to file a complaint to someone. This is the due process that they get. This is how we handle, the discussion and the conflict resolution. These are prescribed, disciplinary actions that can be levied. If those things are all worked out ahead of time, it goes a whole lot smoother, and it makes it also a lot easier for someone to decide if something's a hill they're willing to die on. Right? There's a lot of times where had someone known that the end result could be them being removed from an organization, losing their right to participation, they may not have decided to dig their heels in. But when there's no process in place, there's no mechanism to encourage them to, consider the consequences. So yeah, when there's conflict, there's thresholds of acceptable disagreement. which are pretty, in political parties are pretty broad. But once you get past those thresholds, it's all about, having pre-planned, pre-figured out democratic decision-making processes and conflict resolution processes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when it comes to that sort of disagreement, like Chris was saying, it depends on what level of disagreement. Somebody that's some far right person, simply just doesn't fit in with the Green Party. It doesn't fit with our green values. So, that would not be the right organization for them to join. That said, there's the values that are kind of, what would you call it? Like unshakable, right? But a lot of times our disagreement is not really on the values, it's on implementation, right? It's what's the best implementation of our values. And that's where a lot of our disagreement and conflict comes across. What's the best strategy to get that goal? It's not that we disagree on the goals, but what's the best strategy to get there? And those sort of decisions, we can live with, right? I don't really like this decision, but okay, it's what the majority wanted or whatever. You have to have that decision-making process in place, agreed upon by all the members and ahead of time, so that you can head off any complaints. If someone says, I don't like the outcome of it, well, we all agreed ahead of time this was how we were going to make this decision. And we expect all of our members to abide by that. If for some reason they don't, and it escalates to harassment or something, to where our members can no longer feel safe in the space, they should feel safe here when they're organizing with the Green Party, to express their views and express their opinions without being attacked or harassed or whatever on personal level. It's okay to have disagreement. I'm talking, like harassment. Then you got to have that conflict resolution plan where you can talk with them, you can mediate with them, you can ideally set up a restorative justice program to address it in a way where everyone feels safe and all the harms are resolved. If for some reason that can't happen, then the thing you might have to do is ask that person to leave the organization. You've got to do what is good for all of the members, right? So it can be tough sometimes to know the best thing. And there's a lot of books on how to do restorative justice, how to do conflict resolution, how to do mediation. There's books on how to do, consensus process and decision making. So there's plenty more to learn about all this stuff, which again will have to be future videos, but you can always ask us questions and all. There's a lot of us that have been around and seen lots of this stuff that you can learn from. But this is why it's so important to have it in your bylaws ahead of time, so that folks know exactly what the expectations are, so that you can address them in a fair manner, that you're not just making them up as you go, because then people might feel that you're picking on them or that you're not being fair or whatever. If it's decided ahead of time, it's a much more likely to be a fair process that everyone can respect, because we agreed on it. And if we don't like the outcome, we can talk and use our decision-making processes to change the process for the future. That's how democracy works. So, all right. So the last slide of our whole presentation here was, I think, kind of a summary of some of this stuff. 10 things to remember from Bernie's campaign that I thought were really good tips that we talked about last time. The first one is that when you're organizing, you will make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, so do your best to correct them and move on. Don't dwell on it too much, because if you do, you'll just make yourself burn out, right? We learn from making mistakes, so do the best you can. Own up to your mistakes, try to learn from them, correct them, and just keep going. Everybody makes mistakes. Don't worry about it, and all of us keep working. The second one is assume nothing, follow through on everything. So this is an important one where you should don't assume that something is happening the way that you think or at the right time that you think or whatever. Always follow through on things, check things, double check things, make sure that stuff is set up and proceeding the way that everyone expects. Number 3, make decisions. So this kind of goes with make mistakes, right? Make decisions. So don't agonize. Don't wait for a perfect solution, because there will never be perfect things. based on whatever information you have. Get everyone together, talk about it, think about it a little bit, but then make a decision, and go with it and learn from your mistakes if that happens. Because if you keep agonizing, you keep waiting, then nothing will ever happen. You have to make a decision and go from there. No, I'm not
Makes
saying
me think of the Green Party's media committee.
Yeah.
Right? We will debate and debate and debate the details of a press release to the point that it's not released until after it's relevant.
Right.
Right? It's like we'll spend 3 days really fine tuning what exactly we want to say, but 3 days after the fact, no one cares what we have to say.
Right. Yeah. So
Personal pet
sometimes
peeve there.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to make decisions, and it depends on what timeline you're looking at. And for things like media releases, it needs to go out quick. So depending on when a decision needs to be made, just go and make the decision. And it might not be the perfect solution. It might not be the perfect answer. You might not have perfect knowledge, but that's just how it is sometimes. Number 4, campaigning is a social process. People like to be asked for help and thanked for help. So when you're deep canvassing and all, I think this can relate to our ladders of engagement. Ask folks for help. Start with small asks, work your way up to big asks. And when they help, thank them for their help. And they're more likely to help in the future. They're more likely to bring their friends next time, all that stuff. Organizing is social. You don't do it by yourself. You do it with other people. You build power together and not by yourself.
And as a grassroots party, I think it's important for us to recognize that oftentimes we are relying on exploitative models, right? We're relying on volunteers to do full-time jobs unpaid. I say as a former co-chair, and Garrett's a current co-chair, right?
Right.
To be a national Green Party co-chair is a full-time job to do it right, and they're unpaid, right? This isn't my usual shtick where I plead with Greens to pay people at least a stipend. This is that we need to, you've got to be thankful. You've got to be appreciative, and you've got to be publicly those things. Because when you're running a volunteer-ran organization, people are doing generally thankless work out of the goodness of their own heart, right? So we've got to make sure that we're creating a positive social culture within the campaign where people actually get whatever kind of recognition or things that we can give them to recognize and appreciate them.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see, social. So number 5, in small races, the personal usually dominates. Issues matter more as the campaign grows. So when you're talking about local elections, it's that personal stuff, asking folks, what do they care about? That's what's going to win the election. The abstract issues matter more for like congressional campaigns, right? That's what motivates people for Congress, these big ideas. When you're running for local office, it's whatever people care about. A lot of times it's like, I want my sidewalk paved, or I want the trash picked up. It's a lot of these very local personal things that folks care about. So you want to focus on those. Number 6, the campaign that keeps on the offensive without being offensive will usually win. I like that. So it's you don't want to sling mud necessarily, but you want to keep on the offensive. You want to keep up messaging on your goals, on what the problems are and what the answers are that you have determined together as a community. That is what's going to resonate, which feeds into number 7, right? All politics is local. Translate the big issues that are being talked about nationally into local terms. The Green New Deal is a national policy, but when it's fully implemented, when it's fully moving, it's going to matter a lot in local terms, because it's going to be more jobs. It's going to be solar panels everywhere, wind energy, It's going to be rebuilding a lot of critical infrastructure, building municipal water systems and whatnot, all of the public infrastructure that has been neglected for decades. So you can translate it into how it's going to help folks locally. And that's just one example, obviously, but translate issues into local terms and on the terms that people care about when you were doing your canvassing. Yeah.
Yeah, like if I'm talking about electric arc furnaces, makes a lot more sense in Garrett's dying steel town
Yeah.
than it does here in central Illinois, right? Where I'll probably see far more success talking about, regenerative agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
and decentralizing, decorporatizing agriculture given the fact that I live in one of the major bread baskets of America, right? So which part of the Green New Deal we center will be different, and how do those things,
Yep.
manifest will be different. So, I've got little to no reason to talk about arc furnaces. I don't have a steel industry, and my town has never had one. But it's a very on point thing for Garrett to be talking about in his community, because that abandoned steel mill down the street can start producing steel again, but it can do it in a better way. And it can do it worker owned, and it can do it ecologically.
Yeah, exactly. You translate it. That's kind of the true meaning of decentralization in a sense, right? You customize things for the local conditions and the local issues. And it also relates to the groundwork research we talked about in an earlier slide. If you know the history of your region, for example, in my area of Pittsburgh, there's the steel industry and all dominated. So if I can talk about steel, but hey, we could do steel in a more ecologically friendly way, that's what people relate to. That's the local terms that they understand. Number 8 is this is a really important one for folks joining the Green Party, any sort of independent movement, because the political deck is so stacked against us. It's not that we can't win, but that it is an uphill battle. It's going to take a lot of organizing effort, and it's going to take time. So we have to keep in mind that one campaign is not going to make or break a movement. Even if we don't win that campaign, a losing campaign can still provide the basis for winning next time. There's lessons to learn from that campaign. Even though we didn't get the person elected, we might have built a membership, right? We built connections in our community. We built trust with our community. We learned about the policy that they care about, that we can make sure that we campaign on more next time. There's a lot of lessons we can learn from even the so-called failures. And once we've learned those and integrated into our organizing work, you can be sure that next time we do it, we will win. So yeah, don't get stuck on any particular thing. Just keep fighting, just keep doing it, and learn. Whether you win or lose, learn from that and keep building.
And on the community organizing side, sometimes your victory is that you showed up.
Yeah.
Right. That community, even though you lost, that community saw you shoulder to shoulder in the street. That community saw you putting your blood and sweat into it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though you lost, now you're in a much stronger, much more trusted, much more respected position moving forward to win the next one. And a lot of times that what it means is that you'll be in a position to be ahead of the next one, right? Because if our politics is reacting, rather than being ready for it ahead of time. A good example that I think of is the Arab Spring, right? People who watch the news in the United States think that just kind of happened, right? Oh wow, all of a sudden things really popped off over there. No, I mean, we're talking decades-long organization in places like Egypt to bring down that regime. And some of those organizations ended up being, good guys, and some ended up being bad guys. But the Arab Spring in Egypt that toppled the dictator, a multi-decade dictator, didn't spawn out of thin air, right? Another example that I think of is Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, right? Rosa Parks wasn't just tired. Rosa Parks was tired, but Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired woman who refused to move to the back of the bus. Rosa Parks was a secretary at the NAACP. Rosa Parks was active in the movement. Rosa Parks chose to use, that was a plan. They were going to kick off this thing, right? The boycott didn't just happen. The boycott had planning underground before it actually came into effect. So a lot of time, that one might not be the best example because they won, right? And this is the quotes about losing. But that goes back to, what is a victory? And making sure that we're, not just saying that the only way we win is if we win. Because it's about building blocks. It's about taking steps. It's about building the foundation that can get us to that ultimate victory.
Yep, absolutely. We can't define success for our movement in terms of what the capitalist duopoly defines as success, because their success is not success for the working class. We have to do it differently. All right, so number 9 here is that campaigns should be fun and organizing work should be fun. This is something that often gets overlooked, right? We're all business, right? We have our business meeting and we go home, we do our action and we go home. It should be fun because building community, building trust, getting to know your neighbors and all that should be a fun activity. Building a better world should be a fun activity. So make sure that you're setting aside time to do fun things and social events and have fun as you're campaigning. And this is also important to avoid burnout, so that we can keep organizing, because if we burn out, then you're not helping anything anymore, right? So and lastly, every campaign, every organizing action is a chance to show who you are. So we have to make sure our actions and our campaigns show what we mean by grassroots democracy and show what we mean by doing something different from politics as usual, from the capitalist style politics. Show what we mean by being different from the two old party duopoly system. So that means doing everything differently than the way that they've told us. And like we were saying earlier, sometimes when you recruit folks directly from the Democratic Party, they come in with the baggage. They come in with the expectation to run campaigns like you would in a Democratic Party, which is not actually grassroots democratic, right? It's not actually anti-capitalist. It's not actually pro-working class. So of course we have to do things differently, and we have to show folks how we do different things differently, and that we mean it when we say to do things differently, right? It's embodied in everything we do. It's very visible, transparent. They can see it. Yep. So that's about it. So I guess I'll say real quick if there's any more questions, but otherwise it's pretty late, so we'll call it a night. But we can split up this video into smaller videos, I'm sure.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want to get involved, you can go to greensocialist.net. You can, browse them through our YouTube. We've got lots of things split up into playlists and all that, so you can look at our different resources there. But yeah, at greensocialist.net, you can see when our next 101s are, right? We're doing these quarterly. I assume that Garrett and I in the next couple of days will probably finalize the cycle for what we're going to do for the next cycle, and start promoting those. We've got our weekly podcast. I'll give a shout out real quick. Saturday, this coming Saturday, July 2nd, we're going to have Blazin Bloom on the podcast. Blazin is a green running for Chesapeake School Board. So we're going to have a candidate interview on Howie's Saturday podcast. Our education working group is working on a new political education podcast that'll be happening weekly, so that we're excited about. So we've got a lot going on. You can sign up. You can start going to, coming to weekly meetings, getting involved in our monthly meetings, getting involved in our working group. If you're from a Green Party, a state, or a local, anything like that, and you're interested in us doing some of these workshops with your local, We can tailor them, we can fine tune them to what what you all actually want to talk about, what you all want to actually focus on. If you want to get involved in our education work, that kind of thing, you can email me directly at chris@howiehawkins.us. But you can also, through the sign up and everything, get involved that way. So thank you, everybody, for spending this long Tuesday night with us. And we will see you again in the future. Have a good night and keep on organizing.